Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin the first story. Story 1. The Warehouse of Secrets. My name is Raymond Witherspoon, and as a truck driver, I've traveled the heartland of America countless times. The sky held a cold gray hue as I adjusted my jacket collar, trying to keep the autumn chill at bay. Today's assignment would take me to a remote warehouse in Kansas, far removed from the bustling city life I normally craved. Carlos Norton, my supervisor, called out from across the parking lot with his usual easygoing demeanor. Despite his humor that typically lifted everyone's spirits, something felt different about this particular job. The warehouse we approached had its doors bolted down tight for security purposes, which immediately made me uneasy. An unexplained knot began forming in my stomach as Carlos unlocked the heavy doors. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing a nearly empty space inside that left me curious about what exactly we were here to collect. Carlos gestured toward a few crates positioned near the back of the warehouse, explaining that these needed to be transported to Baltimore. As we approached the mysterious cargo, something foul caught our attention immediately. The odor was so strong that we both instinctively gagged, covering our noses with our sleeves. Carlos checked his clipboard frantically for additional information about our cargo, but his face suddenly became pale as he read whatever details were listed there. His breathing grew shallow and quick as he blurted out that he didn't know what was contained in these crates, but we needed to load them up and leave immediately. There was an unmistakable edge of fear resonating in his voice, which felt both unsettling and deeply confusing to me. The loading process took only 15 minutes under the fading sky, but we both worked with unusual urgency, as if something invisible was pressing us to hurry. After securing everything onto the truck, we stood beside the vehicle, gasping for breath, the tinge of uneasiness still hovering heavily in the atmosphere around us. Without a word of farewell, Carlos hurriedly walked back to his vehicle in an obvious attempt to leave this location as quickly as possible. I couldn't help but feel that Carlos knew something important that he wasn't sharing with me. There was clearly a reason he wanted to depart so urgently from this place. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, a man emerged from behind one of the remaining stacks of crates, startling me completely. He wore an old, tattered hat and an oversized, ragged jacket to keep warm. His face was hidden by a long, unkempt beard, but there was still something recognizable, maybe even familiar, about his overall appearance. This bearded stranger studied my truck intently, silently observing every detail with what seemed like practiced patience. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, he turned away and vanished behind the crates without making even the slightest sound. The moment left me feeling deeply unsettled, as various chilling stories raced through my mind about people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, never to be found again. The drive began calmly enough, despite the relentless thoughts gnawing at my conscience about what those crates might actually contain. The man's unsettling features continued to haunt my peripheral vision as I passed through increasingly desolate stretches of road. Something about this entire situation felt fundamentally wrong, and it wasn't just unfounded paranoia on my part. Hours into the journey, something struck the side of my truck with enormous force, feeling like it could have veered me completely off course if it had lasted even a second longer. My heart raced frantically as panic set in, and I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while trying desperately to regain control of the vehicle. When I glanced at my side mirror, I saw the familiar figure of the bearded man standing on the road behind me, weapon in hand, watching my truck with an expressionless and ominous demeanor. I pulled over immediately, knowing it was essential to call for help. But in this remote location, my cell phone signal was frustratingly weak and essentially useless. The stench from the crates in the back of my truck was becoming increasingly overpowering, stirring an urgent sense that I needed to discover what I was actually transporting before this situation escalated further. That evening, as I pulled into a rural gas station for fuel, I noticed the smell becoming more pungent and almost suffocating in its intensity. I knew there was no way I could continue with these crates any longer without understanding their contents. Mustering all my courage and fighting against every instinct that screamed at me not to investigate, I approached one of the crates and carefully opened it. What I discovered inside was absolutely horrifying and gut-wrenching. Mutilated human body parts were packed within the container, with limbs brutally torn apart from their owners and arranged in a grotesque, nightmarish puzzle. My stomach lurched violently, but before I could fully process the horror before me, I sensed movement coming from behind. The bearded man had materialized from the shadows as if they were part of his very being. His face contorted into an unnerving grin as he casually lifted a crowbar in his hand. The gas station attendant's shout broke through our deadly confrontation, identifying the man as Harrison Merrick, a killer who had been on a months-long spree. In that moment of distraction, I managed to escape to my truck and contact the police, but Harrison proved to be relentless, cunning, and disturbingly intelligent. Though he eventually slipped away into the darkness, his haunting visage and chilling grin remain forever etched into my memory, a reminder that some roads lead to encounters that change us permanently. Story 2: The Phantom Trucker. The temperature had dropped uncomfortably, announcing winter's impending arrival as I made my way back to my trusty rig. My name is Rob, and I've been driving these highways for more years than I care to count. That particular evening, I was heading northbound toward Hagerstown, Maryland, when a dense fog began to envelop the road, obscuring much of what lay ahead and forcing me to drive with increased caution. The atmosphere felt unusually heavy that night, pressing down on everything like a thick blanket. To lighten my mood, I decided to share one of my favorite jokes with Jim, my dispatcher, over the radio. After delivering the punchline about why bicycles can't stand up by themselves, I heard him groan good-naturedly before returning to his duties managing the fleet of drivers scattered across the country. It wasn't long after that conversation when things began to take an increasingly strange turn. The radio started cutting in and out periodically, with local transmissions breaking through the static. News reports filtered through about an escaped murderer named Jonathan Atkins, described as dangerous and unpredictable, targeting victims seemingly without any clear pattern or motivation. Through the swirling mist ahead, I spotted an odd silhouette standing approximately 100 feet up the road. As I approached more closely, I could see it was a man standing motionless in the middle of the lane, completely drenched from head to toe and visibly shivering in the cold night air. Despite every instinct telling me to be cautious, I couldn't simply leave someone stranded in such conditions. I stopped my truck and approached the man through my partially lowered window, trying to sound as friendly and non-threatening as possible. His appearance was almost ghostly pale, matching the fog that surrounded us both. When he asked for help, explaining there had been an accident somewhere ahead, I felt compelled to investigate, though skepticism nagged at the back of my mind. Following him into the murky mist, I noticed how the air seemed to grow even colder with each step we took together. My mind raced with various possibilities about what we might encounter. Was this some kind of elaborate prank, or could it be related to the escaped murderer I had just heard about on the radio? An overturned car soon appeared ahead of us, with steam rising from its engine like an eerie apparition emerging from the darkness. Panic began to wash over me as we approached what appeared to be a genuine accident scene. I wondered if there might be injured passengers trapped inside the vehicle who desperately needed our assistance. However, my concern quickly turned to alarm when I heard footsteps echoing behind us through the dizzying fog. When I turned around, the strange man who had led me here had completely vanished without a trace. A murmur of distress rippled through my mind as I found myself frozen in place, my heart pounding heavily in my chest. The eerie silence that settled around me was broken only by the distant sound of my truck's engine idling in the fog. I glanced around one final time, searching for any sign of the mysterious man, before deciding it was definitely time to leave this unsettling scene immediately. Without looking back at the wrecked car or continuing to search for the vanishing stranger, I hastily made my way back toward my truck with adrenaline pumping through my veins. The fog seemed to swirl around me with increasing intensity, as if it were alive and trying to disorient me further. I climbed into my cab and slammed the door shut, quickly scanning the area to ensure I wasn't being followed by anyone or anything. My shaky hands grabbed the radio as I attempted to contact Steve, a fellow driver who had been traveling in the opposite direction earlier. However, only persistent static responded to my calls, and I couldn't establish any connection with him or anyone else for that matter. The isolation was becoming increasingly overwhelming, and I knew something significant had happened at that accident scene. As I sat there, contemplating my next move and trying to process what I had just experienced, a swirl of fog suddenly revealed a face staring directly at me from within the nearby trees. The realization hit me like a cold wave of terror. This had to be Jonathan Atkins, the escaped murderer whose description matched perfectly with what I was seeing. My heart pounded with genuine fear, knowing that this dangerous individual was somewhere out there in the darkness and could potentially strike at any moment. With no reliable way of calling for help due to the persistent communication problems, I decided on what I knew was a very risky plan. I would need to rely entirely on my own wits and resources to protect myself from this highly dangerous situation. Among my tools in the truck, I found a heavy wrench that could potentially serve as a defensive weapon if the situation deteriorated further. The fog continued to prove itself a formidable enemy, effectively concealing Atkins' exact whereabouts and movements, while I tried to formulate some kind of strategy for survival. The remainder of that night felt like an eternity as I remained vigilant, constantly watching for any signs of movement or threat. Eventually, as dawn began to break and the fog started to lift, I was able to resume my journey, though the memory of that encounter would haunt me for years to come. Sometimes, the most terrifying experiences on the road are those where you never quite know if what you encountered was real or simply a trick of the mind. Story 3. the Desert Stalker. My name is Garrison Hendrick, and people often think that truck driving is a dull and monotonous profession. While it's true that we drivers sometimes create our own little adventures to keep ourselves entertained during long stretches of highway slash, I never imagined that I would soon find myself in a real-life nightmare far more terrifying than any adventure I could have possibly conceived. It all began during one of my typical runs through Las Cruces, New Mexico, where I had stopped for gas and some snacks at a rundown convenience store. While making my purchases, I noticed an elderly woman with a distinctly frantic look etched across her weathered face. She appeared disheveled and kept glancing around nervously, as if she was constantly being watched by some unseen presence that filled her with dread. I attempted to strike up a conversation with her, asking gently if everything was all right. To my surprise, she responded with both fear and urgency, resonating clearly in her trembling voice. She warned me that I needed to watch out around this area, explaining that there was someone dangerous lurking nearby, always watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike unsuspecting travelers. The urgency of her words continued to linger in my mind as I reluctantly left the store to continue on my scheduled route. I couldn't help but notice the way the hair on the back of my neck seemed to be standing on end, as if my body was instinctively responding to some threat that my conscious mind hadn't yet fully recognized or understood. As the sun dipped below the horizon and I continued crossing the empty expanse of desert highway, the typical New Mexico night settled around me. However, tonight felt different somehow, as if there was an additional layer of unease pressing down on the already oppressive sensation of isolation. Even with the radio turned up to full volume, something sinister seemed to be lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. The crackle of my CB radio suddenly interrupted my thoughts, catching me completely off guard. A deep voice started speaking through the static, and the sound was distorted and disturbingly inhuman in its quality. My instinctive reaction was to turn off the radio immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be connected to what the elderly woman had been trying to warn me about earlier. As the night wore on, the isolation only grew more suffocating, and the atmosphere seemed to become heavier with each mile I traveled. The darkness felt almost alive, pressing against the windows of my cab like something trying to get inside. Suddenly, in the distance ahead, I spotted what appeared to be a car seemingly abandoned on the side of the road, its single remaining headlight cutting through the darkness with an unnatural intensity. Unable to suppress my curiosity despite the growing sense of unease, I hesitantly stepped out of my truck to investigate the situation more closely. The steady hum of my idling engine suddenly felt like a lifeline, connecting me to safety as I nervously approached the mysterious vehicle under the star-filled desert sky. Upon closer inspection, I discovered an unsettling sight that made my blood run cold. There was a clear trail of what appeared to be fresh blood leading from the driver's seat of the abandoned car and extending into the desert, disappearing into the darkness among the sagebrush and scattered desert vegetation. In any rational situation, I should have immediately turned back and contacted the authorities at that very moment. However, something seemed to compel me forward, as if there was an indescribable force pushing me deeper into the desert night against my better judgment. As I stumbled blindly through sand and thorny plants that clawed at my legs with every step, I gradually became aware of an unsettling sound carried on the desert wind. It could have been a faded scream, or perhaps it was only audible within my increasingly paranoid mind. Regardless of its source, I couldn't shake it off or ignore its implications. The sound seemed to intensify and close in on me, accompanied by an undeniable sensation that someone or something was positioned directly behind me, watching my every movement. What had started as a vague feeling suddenly became a terrifying reality. When a figure materialized in front of me from the darkness, the man's eyes locked onto mine with a malevolent intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to my soul. Without thinking, my body instinctively thrust a kick in his direction. Before I took off running as fast as my legs could carry me back toward the relative safety of my truck, fear climbed up my throat and formed what felt like a scream as adrenaline rushed through every inch of my body, drowning out the pain and exhaustion. Behind me, I could hear the ugly sound of distorted laughter echoing across the desert landscape, spurring my desperate flight toward my vehicle and whatever sanctuary it might provide. The desert night had transformed from a peaceful backdrop into a hunting ground, and I had unwittingly become the prey. As I finally reached my truck and fumbled with the door handle, I realized that this encounter was far from over, and that somewhere in the vast darkness of the New Mexico desert, a predator was still waiting for his next opportunity to strike. Story 4. The Escape Artist. My name is Raymond Kowalski, and most days my job as a truck driver isn't particularly out of the ordinary. I tend to have my hands full making sure I deliver goods on time, keeping up with family life, and sharing laughable stories with friends over weekend poker games. Little did I know that soon enough, all of that would take a back seat to the most petrifying experience of my entire life. I was hauling a load from Houston, Texas to Boston, Massachusetts, a trip that was long and tedious even by trucker standards. After being on the road for several days, I arrived at one of those large 24-hour truck stops that dot the interstate system like beacons for weary drivers. I picked up an energy drink along with some friendly banter from the cashier working the night shift. The cashier chuckled as he gave me what seemed like an unusual warning, telling me not to get too close to the woods nearby because folks said it wasn't safe for travelers. We exchanged some good-natured ribbing about local superstitions, and I waved as I walked back to my truck. To be honest, it sounded like something you might tell children just to keep them away from potential danger, but it was entertaining nonetheless. That evening, as twilight settled over the landscape, I decided to park my trailer and get some much-needed rest in a nearby motel located just off the main highway. After retiring to my modest room and catching up on calls with loved ones back home, I made sure to set my alarm to wake me before dawn, then allowed heavy eyelids to pull me under into what I hoped would be restful sleep. The sound of police sirens blazing suddenly jolted me awake in the middle of the night, my groggy eyes fixed on the digital clock beside the bed, which read 3:13 in the morning, much earlier than my planned wake-up time. Peering outside through the thin curtains, I saw intimidating showers of red and blue lights, reflecting off buildings from several police cars that had surrounded an apartment complex across the street. A dark figure, vaguely humanoid in shape, suddenly sprinted out of the chaos and disappeared into the woods near the motel with remarkable speed and agility. Sensing that something serious was happening, the idea of calling for help crossed my mind briefly. However, the individual was wearing a hooded sweatshirt with a bandana pulled over their face. making it impossible to give any clear description beyond basic height and build. When morning arrived, and I had somewhat recuperated from the disturbing events of the night before, I couldn't have been more ready to leave this small town and its apparent troubles behind me. The sight of those flashing police lights continued to haunt my thoughts just as much as the loss of Precious. Sleep had affected my overall mood and alertness. While picking up a local newspaper that was sitting on the motel's complimentary reading stand, a front-page headline article immediately caught my undivided attention. A woman had been brutally attacked overnight in her apartment, suffering unspeakable trauma both physically and psychologically. The image of that shadowy figure from only hours before, sprinting away from the scene, flashed back into my mind with crystal clarity. Several hours later, as I was back on the highway trying to focus on the road ahead, I found myself still reflecting deeply on the previous night's disturbing incident. Morning radio hosts were having what seemed like a field day, discussing rumors about a violent, self-proclaimed vigilante who was supposedly lurking within local communities, taking justice into his own hands. As I listened more intently to their discussion and tried to piece together what little information I could gather from their conversation, something unexpected happened that would change everything. My truck suddenly swerved, as if something had struck its side with tremendous force, causing me to fight desperately to maintain control and prevent a complete trailer rollover. My heart was pounding in my chest like an untamable beast as I slammed on the brakes with what felt like reckless force, while my ears reverberated with an eerie, supernatural stillness. Just as I was about to step out of the cab to investigate what had caused this sudden impact, I saw him clearly through the dusty windshield, the same man from the night before, standing only a few feet away. Knives glistened coldly under the roadside lamplight, revealing themselves clearly as they were clutched firmly in both of his gloved hands. His eyes, when they met mine through the glass, were filled with a malice unlike anything I had ever encountered before. The thought of calling for help crossed my mind again, but I hesitated, knowing that this hooded figure had already demonstrated an impressive ability to evade law enforcement. The confrontation that followed would test every survival instinct the first possessed. As I realized that sometimes the most dangerous encounters on America's highways don't involve mechanical failures or weather conditions, but rather the unpredictable human element that can transform an ordinary day into a fight for survival. Story 5. The Widowmaker's Hunt. My name is Patrick Callahan, and I'm what you might call an ordinary guy who happened to stumble into a truck driving career, somewhat by accident. On this particular evening, I was exhausted from a long haul and desperately needed to stretch my legs and grab some food before catching up on sleep inside my comfortable cab. The only place where I truly felt at ease behind the wheel of my 18-wheeler. The tapping on my window caught my attention as I parked at a truck stop along the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas. It was Bruce Kenty, one of those fellow truckers you always see around but never really get to know beyond casual small talk and shared complaints about traffic conditions or dispatcher attitudes. Bruce approached my window with a visibly shaken expression, immediately asking if I had heard about the escaped convict who was supposedly making his way through these parts. When I told him I hadn't caught any recent news, his eyes widened considerably before he continued with obvious concern in his voice, explaining that they called this individual the Widowmaker due to his particularly brutal methods. According to Bruce, This escapee had been on some kind of killing spree across multiple states ever since he had broken out of a high-security prison facility. The detail that made Bruce's account especially disturbing was his description of the killer's signature calling card. He would gouge out his victim's eyes with his bare hands, leaving behind a horrifying trademark that investigators could easily identify. I looked at Bruce sideways and chuckled nervously, telling him that I wasn't going to let some psychopath ruin what I hoped would be a decent meal and some rest. With that somewhat forced reassurance, we headed inside the truck stop diner together, both of us probably more on edge than we wanted to admit to each other or ourselves, as we ate our burgers and fries in relative silence. I found myself constantly scanning the front entrance every few minutes, feeling slightly more paranoid than I had been earlier in the evening. Yet nothing seemed particularly out of the ordinary at first glance. Just regular folks stopping in and out for their late-night sustenance, coffee, and brief conversations with other travelers. Once I had finished eating, I excused myself from the table and made my way toward the restrooms down a poorly lit hallway that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. After washing my hands, I happened to glance into the mirror above the sink, only to catch sight of a tall figure in a bloody prison jumpsuit standing directly behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence. Panic seized every muscle in my body, and my heart began pounding so hard in my chest that I thought it might burst. Without any conscious thought or planning, I lunged desperately for the restroom door in an attempt to escape. The Widowmaker reached for me just as I narrowly slipped through his powerful grip, and I sprinted back toward the main dining area while shouting at the top of my lungs to warn anyone within hearing distance. The chaos that erupted around us was unlike anything I had ever witnessed or imagined. Patrons screamed and scattered in every direction, while others attempted to barricade themselves inside whatever spaces they could find. The sound of someone frantically dialing emergency services, mixed with the blood-curdling noises of violence that seemed to echo from every corner of the building. We huddled together in whatever refuge we could create, listening helplessly to the horrifying sounds coming from other parts of the truck stop. The weight of knowing that people were suffering and possibly dying only feet away from our hiding place was almost unbearable, and we all struggled to maintain our sanity while waiting for what felt like an eternity. When the police sirens finally pierced through the night air, we felt a brief moment of hope that rescue had arrived. However, our relief quickly turned to horror as we realized that even law enforcement seemed to be struggling against this unstoppable force of violence. The Widowmaker had somehow managed to evade capture once again, slipping away into the darkness like a phantom. As I finally escaped that nightmare and returned to the relative safety of my truck, I knew that this experience would haunt me for the rest of my driving career. The knowledge that such evil could strike anywhere, at any time, along the highways I traveled daily, had fundamentally changed how I viewed the world around me and the fragile nature of safety we all take for granted. Story 6. The Fog Walker. It was one of those doldrums and dreary days, not quite rainy, but filled with heavy dampness that seemed to linger in the air, making everything feel uncomfortably moist and cold. I had been driving my truck for countless hours through eastern Arkansas, determined to make good time and get as close to the Tennessee border as possible before finding a suitable spot to park and rest for the night. As I continued down the increasingly desolate road, I found myself making awful dad jokes to keep my spirits up and my mind alert. The humor helped pass the time, though I noticed that the sun was beginning to set earlier than expected, casting long shadows across the landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. I passed by numerous diners and truck stops along the way, but something inside me urged me to keep pushing forward rather than stopping at any of these potentially welcoming establishments. It wasn't until I was genuinely too tired to drive safely that I finally decided to pull into a small, isolated rest stop located just off the main interstate highway. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly normal about this particular rest stop. There were a few other trucks scattered throughout the parking lot, though not many people seemed to be moving around the area. After stretching my legs for a few minutes and taking a much-needed visit to the restroom facilities, I climbed back into my cab with a cup of lukewarm coffee from one of the vending machines. That's when things began to take an increasingly unnerving turn that would change the entire course of my evening. As I reached into my pocket for the keys to start my engine, I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye, across the parking lot, near one of those flickering streetlights that you typically only see in horror movies. Stood what appeared to be a man, though something about his silhouette seemed fundamentally wrong. His outline was large and bulky, with an oversized hood completely obscuring his face from view. He stood completely motionless, just staring directly at me from across the lot, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Despite feeling increasingly uneasy about his presence, I tried to brush off the strange sensation, thinking that perhaps he was simply another truck driver who had stopped to stretch his legs or smoke a cigarette in the cool evening air. Attempting to shake off the growing feeling of dread, I started up my engine and began to settle down in my seat, preparing to continue my journey into the night. However, only moments later, I heard a loud thud against the side of my truck that sent shockwaves through my entire body and caused my heart to race with sudden fear. Looking out my window, I expected to see the hooded figure standing nearby, but he was still positioned at the same spot as before. Now, however, he was no longer alone. Two other similarly dressed individuals had joined him, and all three stood in a perfectly straight row under the faint flickering light of that eerie street lamp. Their faces remained completely hidden beneath their hoods, creating an image that would be burned into my memory forever. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably on the steering wheel when one of the figures suddenly broke away from the group and dashed over to another truck parked nearby. Without any apparent effort, he jumped onto the vehicle's hood and began tearing it apart with his bare hands, creating a deafening screech of metal scraping against metal that filled the night air. Panicking at the display of impossible strength I was witnessing, I turned on my headlights and blasted my horn repeatedly, hoping to create some kind of warning or distraction that might interrupt their destructive behavior. The figures stopped their attack abruptly and turned their heads toward my truck in perfect unison, moving with an eerie synchronization that suggested they were operating under some kind of shared consciousness. For a brief but terrifying second, I caught a glimpse of one figure's face as his hood shifted slightly in the night breeze. What I saw was completely unrecognizable as human, only bloodshot eyes staring out from rotting flesh that looked like something had been eating away at his skin with corrosive acid over an extended period of time. Every rational thought in my mind screamed at me to take some kind of action, but fear had completely consumed my ability to think clearly or move decisively. Finally, clenching my teeth, and telling myself that this was absolutely no time for cowardice. I slammed my foot down hard on the gas pedal and aimed my truck straight toward these menacing figures while letting loose a battle cry that came from somewhere deep within my chest. The supernatural beings leaped out of my path with extraordinary agility that defied human limitations. But my aggressive action was enough to break their focus and send them scattering temporarily. As I sped away from that cursed rest stop, I could hear them attacking my truck from behind, their inhuman hands somehow managing to tear through metal as if it were made of paper rather than reinforced steel. Story 7. The Mirror Man. My name is Connor Beckett, a truck driver from the small coastal town of Autumn Bay in Maine. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm naturally quite skeptical when it comes to strange and unusual occurrences. The trucker lifestyle can indeed be unpredictable, sometimes providing hilarious moments and other times generating frustrating situations. But it's rarely what you might call dull or boring. Last month, while driving through Wisconsin on my usual cross-country route, I came across a diner that seemed completely out of place among the vast farmland that stretched endlessly in all directions. The closest city was many miles away, yet this little retro-style diner sat there like a small island of civilization surrounded by an ocean of agricultural fields and rural countryside. Having skipped breakfast earlier that morning and feeling my stomach protesting loudly, I decided to pull over and give this establishment a try. Entering the diner felt remarkably like stepping back in time to a simpler era, with its cozy atmosphere and nostalgic decorations that immediately gave me a warm, welcoming feeling that reminded me of childhood visits to similar places with my family. The waitress greeted me with a genuinely amused smile, commenting that I looked exactly like someone who had missed breakfast and desperately needed a good meal. As I settled into a comfortable booth and bit into what turned out to be the best burger I had ever tasted at any diner, I began to notice something particularly unusual about the restaurant's interior decoration. One entire wall was covered with newspaper clippings, all focused on missing persons cases that had occurred over the years. What immediately struck me as significant was the clear similarity among all the victims. Every single one of them appeared to be a truck driver who had disappeared while traveling their regular routes across various parts of the country. As I continued reading these disturbing articles while enjoying my unexpectedly delicious meal, I caught sight of someone moving around behind a row of bushes outside the diner's large front windows. It was difficult to make out any specific details from my position inside, but the person appeared to be completely drenched from head to toe in some kind of thick, viscous liquid that looked disturbingly dark in the afternoon sunlight. Curiosity eventually got the better of my natural caution, and I stepped outside to investigate what I had seen more closely. However, when I reached the area where I thought the person had been standing, I found no sign of anyone present, nor any obvious evidence that someone had been there recently. There was only a faint, lingering smell in the air that reminded me strongly of rusty metal, similar to the scent of blood, but without any visible source. The profound discomfort of this unexplained encounter began to creep into my consciousness as various disturbing questions raced through my mind. Was this mysterious person somehow involved in criminal activity? Had I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see? The uncertainty was deeply unsettling, and I decided that the wisest course of action would be to return to my truck and drive as far away as possible from this location. I drove non-stop for several hours, my mind completely unable to shake the strange and troubling encounter I had experienced at the diner. Eventually, feeling both restless and exhausted, I pulled into a truck stop for the night, hoping to catch some much-needed sleep and put the day's events behind me. However, just as I began drifting off into what I hoped would be peaceful slumber, a sharp tap on my window startled me awake. A chill shot through my entire body like an electric shock as I saw a face pressed against the glass directly outside my cab. It was the same individual I had seen behind the bushes at the diner, still drenched in that dark, viscous liquid that now appeared even more sinister in the dim lighting of the truck stop. His eyes met mine with an intensity that made me feel as though he could see directly into my soul. Fear gripped my body completely as sweat began pouring down my face, and my trembling hands frantically searched for my cell phone, while the figure outside continued pounding on my window with increasing intensity. Each impact jarred my entire truck and sent vibrations through my body that I could feel in my bones. I managed to dial emergency services, though remaining calm while relaying my desperate situation proved nearly impossible. The operator assured me that help was on the way and advised me to remain on the line and stay inside my vehicle no matter what happened. However, feeling trapped and defenseless in my truck, while this clearly dangerous individual continued his assault on my window, I could no longer maintain my grip on rational thought or passive waiting for rescue. Story 8. The Butcher of Baxter. It was an unusually balmy evening for autumn in Baxter, Iowa, and as a truck driver named Harland Fassett, I had certainly experienced my fair share of strange and unsettling encounters during my years on the road. However, what occurred in this small Midwestern town would prove to be, by far, one of the most disturbing and memorable experiences of my entire driving career. I had been driving straight for many hours without a significant break, so when I finally pulled up to a practically empty truck stop, I was more than eager for a hot, satisfying meal and a strong cup of coffee to help me stay alert for the remaining portion of my journey. The fluorescent lights of the attached diner welcomed me, like a beacon calling to a weary traveler seeking refuge from the darkness. Upon stepping inside the establishment, I couldn't help but notice and chuckle at an offbeat bumper sticker that someone had placed on one of the booth tables. It read, "Honk if you love necromancers," which struck me as either someone's idea of dark humor or perhaps a warning that I should have taken more seriously than I did at the time. My boots scuffed along the worn linoleum floor as I approached the counter and placed my order with Penelope, the rather short-tempered waitress who seemed to be the only staff member working that evening. She offered me a half-hearted smile as she poured my coffee, mentioning casually that they didn't get many visitors in this area, which seemed like it would make running a successful business quite challenging. While I waited for my food to arrive, I couldn't help but notice the complete absence of other customers, which wasn't entirely surprising given how late it was, but still added an distinctly eerie atmosphere to the place. Moments after my burger arrived and Penelope had disappeared from sight again, leaving me completely alone in this roadside establishment, I heard the small bell above the entrance door chime softly. Another patron wandered into the diner, and his appearance immediately caught my attention in the most unsettling way possible. He looked completely disheveled and was covered from head to toe in various types of filth and grime. His oily hair hung low over his ghostly pale face, and dark circles surrounded his bloodshot eyes, giving him an almost supernatural appearance. Rather than ordering anything, or even acknowledging Penelope's presence, he simply shuffled over to a table near the back of the restaurant and sat down heavily. Occasionally, he would shoot me deeply unsettling glances before returning his attention to staring out into the dark, empty parking lot with an intensity that made me increasingly uncomfortable. An inexplicable sense of unease began growing in my stomach as I strained to identify what exactly was causing my anxiety. But everything outside appeared completely normal. Some deeply buried survival instinct must have activated, because I quickly wrapped up the remainder of my meal, left cash on the table, and headed directly toward the exit without looking back. I didn't even register the soft, knowing laughter of Penelope echoing from somewhere behind me as I made my hasty retreat. Once back inside my truck, I immediately cranked up the engine and performed a quick security check to ensure that my cargo was properly secured before attempting to leave this increasingly uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible. Minutes passed without any apparent interruption or incident, but with every breath I took, it felt like something fundamental didn't belong in this picture. That's when I spotted him again. The strange man from the diner was walking at a disturbingly leisurely pace directly toward my truck, and that same grotesque grin was plastered across his face like a permanent mask. My heart began racing uncontrollably as I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal with tremendous force, causing my truck to roar out of the parking lot as fast as the engine would allow. I was desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that deeply unnerving individual who seemed to radiate malevolent intent from every pore. Every fiber of my being was screaming that something about this man was fundamentally and dangerously wrong. He wasn't merely eccentric or socially awkward. There was something genuinely inhuman about his behavior and appearance that triggered every warning signal my mind possessed. Despite accelerating to dangerous speeds, his figure somehow remained visible in my rearview mirror for what seemed like hours. What made the situation even more terrifying was that he wasn't running or shouting or displaying any normal human reaction to my sudden departure. Instead, he continued to smile with that same disturbing expression, as if he was genuinely amused by my escalating terror and found my desperate attempts to escape thoroughly entertaining. The most chilling aspect of this entire encounter was my growing realization that this individual wasn't operating according to normal human limitations or behaviors. There was something supernatural or otherworldly about his ability to remain in view despite the increasing distance between us, until he suddenly and inexplicably vanished into shadows that hadn't existed just seconds before. Story 9. The Nightmare Convoy. My name is Kermit Fry, and I consider myself a simple man with equally simple pleasures, occasionally indulging in a drink after particularly long hours of driving on what can be a genuinely lonely and isolating job. On this particular Monday morning, I climbed into my old, rusty truck, ready to hit the road and transport cargo across the vast and beautiful state of Montana. The traffic seemed unusually light that day, with fewer truckers than normal exchanging their typical sarcastic jokes and commentary over the CB radio frequencies that usually keep us connected during long stretches of highway side. To take full advantage of this peaceful break by stopping at a secluded rest area nestled between picturesque trees, where I could stretch my legs properly and enjoy some much-needed peace and quiet. As I took a leisurely walk through the parking lot, breathing in the fresh mountain air and appreciating the natural beauty surrounding this location. I noticed something distinctly strange happening near one of the other trucks parked nearby. Someone was working methodically, applying what appeared to be duct tape to the vehicle's exhaust pipe with careful precision. The person performing this unusual task looked noticeably jittery and unsure of themselves, which immediately gave me an uneasy feeling that this wasn't some harmless prank or routine maintenance activity. The deliberate nature of their actions, combined with their nervous behavior, suggested something far more sinister was taking place before my eyes. A moment later, this mysterious individual caught sight of me watching their activities and immediately sprinted into the nearby wooded area, disappearing among the trees with remarkable speed. While I felt deeply unsettled by this unexpected encounter, I didn't have adequate proof or evidence to justify calling for immediate help from law enforcement. Instead, I decided to report the incident to our dispatch support center, providing them with as much detail as possible about what I had witnessed. Little did I realize at the time that this strange encounter was merely the opening act of what would become an increasingly terrifying and dangerous situation that would unfold over the coming hours. As night began to fall around me, I continued my journey through the winding roads that were surrounded by dense forests on both sides. The monotonous hum of my truck's engine and the rhythmic pattern of my tires crushing gravel beneath them created a hypnotic effect that nearly lulled me into a dangerously relaxed state of mind. Only the steady beam from my headlights, piercing through the increasingly menacing shadows, kept me alert enough to avoid falling asleep at the wheel. However, my peaceful drive was abruptly interrupted by an unusual noise that seemed to be coming from somewhere behind my trailer, mixing with the familiar sounds of my vehicle's normal operation. Swiveling my head around to investigate the source of this disturbance, I was shocked to see a shadowy figure clinging to my truck with what appeared to be superhuman strength. One muscular hand was gripping tightly onto the edge of my trailer, and the person's entire body was positioned in a way that suggested they had been hanging on for quite some time. Panic immediately set in as I realized the extremely dangerous nature of this situation, but I didn't dare slam down hard on the brakes, knowing full well that such an action could result in disastrous consequences for both myself and whoever was clinging to my vehicle. Instead, I chose to swerve abruptly in an attempt to throw this unwanted passenger off balance. As my truck jerked violently from side to side due to my evasive maneuvering, I heard a sharp hissing sound that seemed to come from the figure outside, but they remained stubbornly attached to my vehicle despite my best efforts to dislodge them. My heart was pounding frantically in my chest as I pressed the gas pedal harder, causing my tires to screech against the pavement. I sped through increasingly desolate stretches of highway and dimly lit small towns that were now completely enveloped in the eerie embrace of night. The silent figure clinging to my truck maintained their grip with a calm determination that was deeply disturbing, as if this type of dangerous activity was completely routine for them. To my enormous relief, as we approached a town where I knew there was some police presence, the mysterious figure suddenly released their hold on my vehicle and disappeared into the darkness without any warning or explanation. I was breathing heavily with adrenaline still coursing through my veins, but I finally felt some measure of safety returning, though I suspected this might be nothing more than a temporary illusion. Story 10. The Highway Stalker. My name is Porter Fallen, and I'm a truck driver who has been fortunate enough to see virtually every corner of the United States during my years behind the wheel. What started as an ordinary day, cruising down a remote stretch of highway in Montana, would soon transform into something far more sinister and dangerous than I could have ever anticipated. I had stopped to grab a quick bite at an old diner just outside of Helena, where the atmosphere was typical of these roadside establishments. Friendly staff, hearty food, and the kind of comfortable worn-in feeling that makes travelers feel welcome. While chewing on my burger and enjoying the brief respite from driving, I couldn't help but overhear to local residents engaged in a hushed conversation about a series of strange incidents. These weren't just ordinary traffic accidents or weather-related problems they were discussing. There was something genuinely unsettling in their voices as they spoke about unexplained occurrences that had been happening in the area recently, though they were careful not to provide too many specific details that might alarm other patrons in the restaurant. After finishing my meal and paying my bill, I continued driving toward my next scheduled destination in Spokane, feeling refreshed and ready to tackle the remaining miles ahead of me. Initially, everything seemed perfectly normal as I maintained a steady pace down the highway. But it wasn't long before I began to notice an unfamiliar car following behind me at a consistent distance. At first, I assumed it was simply another driver who happened to be traveling in the same direction. Perhaps someone who was content to maintain the same speed rather than constantly passing and being passed by other vehicles. However, after spending considerable time on the road together and observing multiple opportunities for this car to either leave the highway or overtake my slower-moving truck, I began to grow increasingly suspicious. My initial assumption that this was merely a coincidence gradually gave way to a growing sense of unease as I tried various subtle tests to determine whether I was actually being followed. I attempted random turns onto side roads, varied my speed both faster and slower than normal traffic flow, and took unexpected exits. But through each of these maneuvers, the mysterious vehicle continued to maintain its position behind me. As darkness approached and shadows began to swallow the last remnants of daylight, I realized that despite my best efforts to shake off this persistent tail through random direction changes and diverse speed variations, the car remained steadily positioned behind my truck. Not once had the driver attempted to overtake me or pull off onto another road, which would have been the normal behavior for an innocent fellow traveler. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense with each mile we traveled together, and my fear continued to escalate as I began to understand that this was no accidental encounter. Without any warning whatsoever, the car suddenly accelerated and aggressively sideswiped my truck, creating an impact intense enough to cause me to swerve dangerously out of control for several terrifying seconds. Mercifully, I managed to regain control of my vehicle with only minimal visible damage, though I was understandably shaken by this unprovoked attack. The aggressive car had come to a complete stop nearby, and for a brief moment, an eerie stillness settled over the scene as if time itself had temporarily frozen in place. Then the driver emerged from his vehicle, and what I saw made my blood run cold with terror. He was extraordinarily tall, almost unnaturally so, and wore a long trench coat that seemed to flutter slowly in the evening breeze with an otherworldly quality. His face was completely obscured by deep shadows, making it impossible to distinguish any recognizable human features. In his hand, he held something that caught and reflected what little light was available. Perhaps a knife or some kind of metal weapon that glinted menacingly in the growing darkness. I knew immediately that I had to take decisive action to protect myself. So, with my heart hammering frantically in my chest, I pressed my foot down as hard as possible on the accelerator. My truck lurched forward with incredible force, and I aimed directly toward my assailant with terrifying speed and determination. The mysterious man managed to step aside at the last possible moment, narrowly escaping being crushed beneath the massive weight of my vehicle. But not before I caught a glimpse of his reaction to my desperate counterattack. What struck me most was his complete lack of normal human responses, like fear, surprise, or anger. His head simply turned toward me with mechanical precision, and that twisted grin never faltered for even a second, as if my attempt to defend myself was nothing more than an amusing game to him. Story 11. The Rest Stop Reaper. My name is Alton Whitaker, and I work as a truck driver for a major distributor based in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. While most people tend to look down on my profession with a certain degree of condescension, I always remind them that whenever it's Thanksgiving and they're stuffing their faces with turkey, they should remember that they need guys like me to bring that food to their local stores in the first place. Truck driving is certainly a job where you encounter all kinds of people from every walk of life. But let me tell you about one particular time when things became downright terrifying in ways I never could have imagined. It was what you might call an otherwise ordinary day, or at least a truck driver's equivalent of ordinary, which means trucking along seemingly endless roads with nothing but occasional radio static for company. I was delivering computer components to some electronics store in Denver, and they were running behind schedule. So, to avoid the heavy traffic that builds up during normal business hours, I had to drive through the night, which was absolutely exhausting, even for someone accustomed to irregular sleeping patterns and long stretches behind the wheel. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, I decided to pull over at a rest stop located near some woods to grab myself some much-needed coffee and take a brief break from the hypnotic rhythm of highway driving. A chilly breeze, accompanied by an unusual stench, immediately washed over me as I stepped out of my truck. And the smell was unlike anything I had ever encountered before in my years on the road. The odor was almost putrid in its intensity, but it also carried an oddly floral undertone that made the combination even more disturbing and unidentifiable. As I walked toward the rest stop's small cafe, hoping that caffeine would help me stay alert for the remaining portion of my journey, I noticed a somewhat disheveled individual standing in the distance. This person was just standing there motionless, keeping his eyes fixed directly on me with an intensity that immediately made me uncomfortable. He was quite tall and wore tattered clothes that were covered with dark stains that looked like much more than just ordinary dirt or grease from automotive work. Deciding not to automatically assume the worst about any stranger I might encounter during my travels, I did my best to ignore his presence and continued walking toward the building, where I could get coffee and perhaps a snack to help maintain my energy levels. However, after purchasing my coffee and starting to head back to my truck, things took a decidedly unpleasant turn. That strange individual had somehow managed to appear directly behind me without making even the slightest noise during his approach, which should have been impossible given the gravel surface of the parking area. Before I fully comprehended what was happening, He placed his hand on my shoulder with what felt like an iron grip that seemed to penetrate through my jacket and shirt. When I turned around to face him and attempted to make light of the situation with a nervous joke about new types of handshakes, he didn't respond with words or even acknowledge my attempt at humor. Instead, he simply gave me the most nauseating grin I had ever seen, revealing what remained of his teeth, which were completely rotted and caked with what appeared to be dried blood. A profound feeling of dread immediately washed over my entire body, and I instinctively knew that I had to escape from this situation as quickly as possible, using every ounce of strength I could muster. I jerked myself free from his surprisingly powerful grasp and bolted toward my truck as fast as my legs could carry me. My heart was pounding frantically as I scrambled inside my cab, slammed the door shut with tremendous force, and immediately engaged all the locks. The deranged man began snarling like some kind of wild animal and proceeded to pound on my window with his fists, creating a rhythmic thudding sound that seemed to echo through my entire truck. Desperate to escape this nightmarish encounter, I started up my engine as quickly as possible. But just as I was about to press the accelerator and flee this location, he threw his entire body weight against the side of my truck with such force that the whole vehicle rocked violently, as if it had been struck by some kind of earthquake or explosion. Story 12. The Shadow Collector. My name is Elliot Summers, and it certainly isn't every day that you find yourself at the center of what feels like a real-life horror movie unfolding around you. The entire terrifying experience began at a truck stop located just off the interstate in Amarillo, Texas, where I had just finished refueling my 18-wheeler and was genuinely looking forward to enjoying a hot meal and a cold beer before hitting the road again. I had loaded my burnt coffee into the truck cabin and climbed up into the familiar embrace of my worn driver's seat when I caught sight of my friend Dean Jameson, another professional driver whom I had met several years back during some downtime between hauls. He was walking over with his hands carefully cupping to steaming cups of coffee, and cheerful chuckles were floating through the air like cartoon speech bubbles. Dean approached with one of his typical jokes, asking if I had ever heard the one about the truck driver who forgot to put on his clothes before weighing in at a scale house. When I shook my head and encouraged him to continue, he delivered the punchline about their weight being in the nude zone, which caused him to burst into laughter at his own comedic timing and wordplay. As we sat in our respective trucks and chatted about our upcoming routes, our conversation naturally turned to discussions of our favorite restaurants located along Interstate 40 and various other topics that drivers typically share during these brief social encounters. However, I gradually became aware that someone was watching us intently from a considerable distance. I couldn't make out specific facial features or identifying characteristics from my position, but I could clearly see a tall silhouette framed against the distant setting sun. This mysterious figure stood completely motionless while Dean and I continued our conversation, apparently unaware that we were being observed with such focused attention. When I turned back to point out this unusual observer to Dean, I discovered that the stranger had completely vanished without leaving any trace of where he might have gone. While this disappearance was certainly unnerving, I decided not to worry too much about it, since travelers encounter all kinds of strange people during long hauls across the country. Dean and I eventually agreed to meet for dinner at our favorite diner located just off Exit 15 in Little Rock, a place we had discovered during previous trips and had grown fond of due to their excellent food and friendly service. We shook hands in farewell, and I returned to the freeway with Dean trailing slightly behind me, as we both headed toward our planned rendezvous. As I made my way down the highway, I found it impossible to shake off that odd feeling of being watched that had begun to seep into every corner of my consciousness. The sensation was persistent and deeply unsettling, like having an itch that you can't quite reach, or a song stuck in your head that won't go away no matter how hard you try to focus on other things. A couple of hours later, Dean and I were sitting comfortably in a booth at the diner, examining the menu and admiring the local decor that covered the walls with vintage signs and interesting antique paraphernalia that gave the place a warm, nostalgic atmosphere. We both ordered our respective comfort foods, burgers for me, while Dean chose the meatloaf dinner special. As we enjoyed our meals together, with Dean devouring his plate with his characteristic enthusiasm and gusto, it became impossible to ignore what unfolded next. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop noticeably as everyone present witnessed another patron entering the establishment, and the atmosphere changed dramatically in an instant. It was none other than the stranger from earlier who had been watching us at the truck stop, and his appearance was even more disturbing in the bright fluorescent lighting of the diner. He seemed completely devoid of normal human emotion, sporting unkempt facial hair and disheveled clothing that suggested he had been living rough for an extended period. This strange man locked eyes with me in a gaze so cold and penetrating that it sent shivers throughout my entire body and made me feel as though ice water was flowing through my veins. He paused directly in front of our booth for what felt like an eternity, creating a moment of tension that seemed to stretch time itself, before proceeding toward the restroom area in complete silence. Without thinking twice about the potential consequences, I whispered urgently to Dean about my earlier encounter with this individual at the truck stop, and explained how profoundly unnerving this entire situation felt to me. Dean, who was clearly not someone who shied away from confronting strangers or potentially dangerous situations, quickly finished his meal and walked toward the restroom as well. Story 13. The Beast. It was an unusually balmy evening for autumn in Montpelier, Idaho, and as a truck driver who had traveled extensively across the country, I had encountered my fair share of strange and memorable experiences during my years behind the wheel. My name is Jarvis Gilman, and the solitude of long-distance driving had always suited my personality well, providing me with the sanctuary I needed to think and reflect during those countless hours on the road. However, at this particular moment in time, I found myself wishing I had some company to help me process what was about to unfold. I had stopped at a little-known diner located off the main highway, and it struck me as an ideal place to enjoy some authentic local cuisine while engaging in friendly small talk with the good folks who called this area home. As I settled into a comfortable booth and began working my way through a surprisingly delicious sandwich, an older gentleman sitting at a nearby table let out a hearty chuckle and looked at me with eyes that sparkled with both wisdom and mischief. He appeared to be the type of person who had accumulated many stories over the years and genuinely enjoyed sharing them with interested listeners. The elderly man began telling me about how this particular area had once been terrorized by an infamous, unidentified serial killer whom the local residents had nicknamed the Beast. According to his account, nobody had ever managed to get a clear, detailed look at this mysterious figure. and he seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to slip away into the shadows, like fog escaping through your fingers. Of course, I responded to his tale with appropriate chuckles and expressions of interest, because who wouldn't appreciate hearing a good story about legendary threats and local folklore? With a grin, I expressed my hope that this dangerous individual had either reformed his ways or moved on to terrorize some other unfortunate community far from this peaceful location. After we exchanged pleasant conversation and parted ways on friendly terms, I returned to my truck and continued down the highway, while the old man presumably went about his own business in parts unknown. Several hours later, I found myself parked near an industrial complex not too far from Montpelier, and it was getting quite late in the evening. I desperately needed an extra boost of caffeine to help keep me alert and focused for the remaining stretch of my journey. So I began making my way toward my cab's sleeping compartment, where I kept various supplies. However, when I reached into my storage area, I suddenly realized with considerable frustration that I had accidentally left my favorite thermos back at the diner where I had eaten dinner. Resigned to the loss of my coffee container and preparing to get back on track with my scheduled delivery, I was genuinely surprised to discover my missing thermos sitting on top of a small heap of garbage bags, not far from where my truck was parked. The container was positioned in what appeared to be an abandoned parking lot, and I couldn't begin to imagine how it had arrived at this particular location. As I stepped closer to retrieve my wayward thermos, I noticed a man shrouded in darkness standing nearby, with facial features that were barely discernible in the dim lighting conditions. My instincts immediately began sending warning signals, but I was determined to recover my lost property. So I stepped forward and attempted to break the tension with a display of friendly gratitude. I called out a cheerful thank you for finding my thermos, but the strange figure offered no response whatsoever. His movements remained as still as a grave marker, and in that moment, my curiosity quickly transformed into genuine concern and apprehension. My breathing became shallow and labored as fear began to urge me to flee this location immediately. My survival instincts were clearly alerting me to an impending threat, but the opportunity for escape would prove to be frustratingly elusive. The shadowed figure suddenly lunged at me with tremendous force that knocked me completely off balance and pinned me down against the cold, hard ground with one hand gripping my throat in a vice-like stranglehold. My vision began to blur significantly as this menacing silhouette hovered over me like some kind of supernatural predator. This had to be the beast that the old man had warned me about, and I knew it with absolute certainty, even though I had never seen this individual before in my life. My fight-or-flight instincts immediately kicked into high gear, with each desperate breath fueling my growing terror and sense of complete helplessness. A sharp, stabbing pain suddenly pierced through my leg, as a serrated knife carved deep into the flesh and muscle tissue, causing blood to ooze freely from the fresh wound. Despite the sensation of searing hot iron flooding through my entire nervous system, I managed to grasp blindly at my attacker's arm, frantically ripping and clawing in a desperate attempt to break free from his overwhelming grip. Story 14. The Crimson Smile. My name is Phil Morgandle, and I consider myself a devoted father of 3 wonderful children and an aspiring comedian who was slowly beginning to lose his sanity under the mounting pressure of an increasingly bizarre and terrifying ordeal. It all began on what seemed like a perfectly normal day, as I started my routine work as a truck driver in the small town of Acme, Pennsylvania, where I had lived and worked for several years. As I approached my trusty semi-truck to begin another day of hauling cargo across the countryside, I immediately spotted something quite strange splattered across my windshield. There was a peculiarly shaped red stain that vaguely resembled a sinister face, complete with a twisted, menacing grin, and the sight of it immediately gave me uncomfortable goosebumps that ran down my spine. I decided to shrug off this unusual discovery and proceed with my planned route. Since you never really know what kind of weird and inexplicable things you might encounter in this particular line of work. As I steered my way through the snaking roads and fog-covered hills that characterize much of Pennsylvania's landscape, I began to notice something even more disturbing than the mysterious stain. My cell phone wouldn't stop buzzing persistently with missed calls from an unknown number that didn't appear in my contacts list. The constant interruptions were becoming increasingly annoying, so I finally pulled over to the side of the road to answer this persistent caller and find out what they wanted from me. When I barked a greeting into the phone, a hoarse voice, filled with unmistakable panic, whispered urgently through the speaker, asking me a question that made my blood run cold. The caller wanted to know who was driving alongside me at that very moment, which seemed like an impossible question, since I was certain that nobody else was sharing the road with me. My voice began to trail off as I instinctively glanced in my side mirror, only to discover that there was indeed another truck positioned directly behind mine that definitely hadn't been there just minutes before. The ominous voice continued hissing over the phone connection, instructing me to ignore this mysterious vehicle. But how could I possibly ignore something that was following so closely behind me? The menacing truck was practically glued to my tailgate at an uncomfortably close distance that violated every safety, rule, and courtesy guideline that professional drivers are supposed to follow. Feeling increasingly cornered and confused by this nightmarish situation that seemed to be developing on wheels, I decided to attempt losing this unwanted follower by significantly increasing my speed. However, I quickly discovered that the threatening truck matched my pace with perfect precision, maintaining that same dangerously close distance, regardless of how fast I drove. At that moment, I realized that whoever was operating that vehicle seemed to genuinely enjoy traveling at high speeds, and my unnamed tormentor suddenly floored their accelerator as their truck began to veer aggressively toward mine. What followed was a deadly game of chicken between our two massive vehicles. With that sinister red grin streaked across their windshield, seeming to mock me in the pale moonlight that filtered through the clouds above. In response to this escalating threat, I steered my truck closer to the edge of a steep cliff that bordered the highway, with my vehicle screeching in protest as I pushed it to its mechanical limits. For a split second, I seriously contemplated whether attempting to outrun this chase would ultimately prove to be futile. But with sheer determination and grit, I pressed the pedal even harder. Moments later, I managed to pull ahead sufficiently that I found my antagonist falling behind, though I suspected this advantage would probably be temporary at best. Sweating profusely from the stress and adrenaline of this high-speed pursuit, I pulled over at the next available rest stop to catch my breath and attempt to process everything that had just transpired. As I paced anxiously outside near the vending machines, mentally recounting all the details of this surreal encounter, an elderly man approached me with obvious concern written across his weathered features. The senior citizen asked if I was feeling all right, and his furrowed brow clearly showed that someone else had noticed my distressed state and was worried about my well-being. I responded with a voice that was still quivering from fear and adrenaline, telling him about my recent brush with death and the mysterious truck that had been pursuing me so aggressively. A glimmer of horror flashed across the old man's eyes as he muttered something about having heard of this particular truck before. He explained that a complete lunatic was known to drive it, and this individual apparently took genuine pleasure in tormenting innocent drivers like myself and him, though he couldn't provide specific details about the driver's identity or motivations. When I pressed him for more information about who this dangerous person might be, or why they engaged in such reckless and threatening behavior, the elderly gentleman simply shook his head sadly and walked away without offering any additional details. His silence did absolutely nothing to reduce my growing apprehension about this situation. Story 15. The Grinning Spectre. My name is Jarvis Lancaster, and I work as a truck driver by trade. Though I never expected that my profession would lead me to an encounter that I'll never be able to forget for the rest of my life. The experience began while I was driving through the desolate dirt roads that wind around a small town in Kansas, which was strange enough even before things took a much more sinister turn. Aside from the crooked welcome sign that greeted visitors with an unsettling creaking sound as it swayed in the wind, and the unexplained drone of cicadas rising from the surrounding fields, the area felt fairly standard for rural Kansas. However, the first real oddity occurred right as I parked my rig outside the local diner, hoping to grab a decent meal and perhaps some friendly conversation. A fellow trucker, whose name I unfortunately can't remember now, uttered something quite disconcerting under his breath just before walking away from our brief encounter. He mentioned something about how bodies around here seemed to collect more scars than memories, then trailed off with a visible shiver before making a quick departure that left me feeling somewhat unsettled. I initially brushed off his cryptic warning as nothing more than the kind of nonsense that fatigue tends to produce in drivers who have been on the road for too many consecutive hours to lighten my own mood and counter the strange atmosphere. I reminded myself of one of my favorite jokes about why the Scarecrow won an award: because he was outstanding in his field. As evening fell around me, I hit the road again, and it wasn't very long before something unusual caught my attention in the distance. There was a distinct glint of light emanating from what appeared to be a seemingly abandoned farmhouse located quite far from the main highway, and I felt oddly compelled to investigate this mysterious illumination. I decided to pull over and make my way toward the property on foot, with the moonlit gravel crunching underneath my boots with each step I took. When I finally reached the farmhouse, I was greeted by the disturbing sight of numerous rotting doors that had been lined up against the decaying exterior wall in what seemed to be a deliberate arrangement. This discovery struck me as particularly peculiar, but before I could examine the scene more closely, I heard faint cries for help coming from behind one of these mysterious doors. The sound of someone calling for assistance immediately played on my conscience, and despite my growing unease about this entire situation, I felt compelled to investigate further. Although this sleepy town seemed like the last place where such dangerous things would happen, something deep inside me insisted that I should try to help whoever was trapped behind that door. I began prying it open, and as soon as the barrier tore free from its hinges, it revealed a man whose arms were bound tightly behind his back with coarse rope. Tape had been stretched grotesquely over his mouth, and he immediately collapsed at my feet in what appeared to be a state of exhaustion and relief. As I began the process of untying this clearly traumatized individual, I asked him urgently who had done this terrible thing to him, though my heart was already racing with anticipation of his answer. The man gasped for air as I removed his restraints, explaining that he hadn't gotten a good look at his captor because the attacker wore a hooded shirt that obscured his facial features. He pleaded desperately with me to call for help, but unfortunately, my cell phone signal was frustratingly weak in this remote location, making communication with the outside world virtually impossible. With no other viable option available to us, we both knew that we had to return to my truck as quickly as possible, so that we could attempt to reach civilization and contact law enforcement. However, as we hastily moved toward my vehicle, rustling sounds erupted from the tall grass that surrounded us on all sides, causing our panic to intensify dramatically. Once again, I found myself cursing the feeble phone signal that prevented me from calling for immediate assistance. We paused in our tracks when a hooded figure stepped into view, and his eerily calm expression contrasted sharply with the blood that was spattered across his partially visible face in a pattern that suggested recent violence. The moonlight reflected menacingly off the jagged hunting knife that he clutched firmly in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone of cold amusement. He sneered at us, asking whether we thought we could steal his prey, before charging directly at me with blood-curdling fury and obvious murderous intent. Fumbling frantically through my pockets, I managed to pull out my trusty pocket knife, just in time to parry his initial blow and prevent what could have been a fatal strike. We struggled violently in the moonlight, with desperate cries mixing with frenzied grunting as each of us jockeyed for control in this precarious life-or-death battle that seemed to stretch on forever. Through sheer survival instinct, I swung at him with all the force I could muster, but unfortunately missed my target and only managed to slice off a chunk of his hood instead of inflicting any real damage. The man reeled back in anger before quickly regrouping and raising his weapon high above his head, like some kind of medieval executioner preparing for the final blow. As our weapons clashed again and again, with adrenaline surging through my veins like electricity, I came to the horrifying realization that putting an end to this grisly encounter was beyond anything I could realistically accomplish. This was not just improbable, but perhaps even impossible, given the inhuman strength and determination of my opponent. This hooded figure was clearly far from normal and had absolutely no intention of stopping his heinous activities until one of us was dead. We continued our desperate dance of death, locked in a battle that I knew was far from over, when suddenly the piercing sound of police sirens cut through the night air, approaching our location at what seemed like lightning speed. The hooded man hesitated for just a moment upon hearing the approaching law enforcement, then dashed into the darkness as if he were disappearing into thin air itself. I exhaled deeply, with the knife still clenched tightly in my trembling hand, grateful beyond words for the sudden arrival of the authorities that had provided me with an opportunity to help the man I had rescued. With law enforcement's assistance, we managed to get the victim proper medical attention and file a comprehensive report about our findings regarding this twisted situation. Over the course of the next few days, the entire town was thrown into an uproar as details emerged about the months of murders and kidnappings that had been taking place under everyone's noses. All of these terrible crimes had been committed by one man named Nathaniel Fletcher, who had earned the chilling nickname the Scourge of Littleton, due to his particularly brutal methods and seeming ability to evade capture, as horrific details emerged from investigators who searched his property and discovered hidden cellars, underground chambers, and makeshift surgical theaters. One thing became crystal clear about this case. This was absolutely no ordinary killer that we were dealing with, but rather someone whose intelligence, ruthlessness, and capacity for evil made him a formidable and elusive foe that even experienced law enforcement officers found difficult to track down and apprehend successfully. Story 16: The Vanishing Driver. My name is Doug Wilson, and I consider myself quite a skeptic when it comes to tales of the eerie and supernatural, preferring to rely on logic and rational explanations for unusual occurrences. It was around 8 o'clock on a chilly autumn evening when this particularly unnerving experience transpired, fundamentally challenging my worldview and leaving me with questions that still haunt me to this day. I was driving my truck down a desolate stretch of road near Walbridge, Ohio, when my vehicle suddenly broke down without any warning or obvious mechanical symptoms. Muttering under my breath about the terrible timing of this mechanical failure, I stepped out of my truck to inspect the issue and determine whether it was something I could fix myself or would require professional assistance. Fortunately, Ben Evans, my best friend and fellow truck driver, was conducting his own rounds in the nearby area, so I called him for help with this frustrating situation. As he approached my disabled vehicle, Ben couldn't resist making his typical good-natured jokes about my predicament, asking whether I was stuck in mud again, as if dirty pants would bother someone who worked in our profession. I responded with my own sarcastic retort about how amusing he was, though it genuinely felt good to have him around, even though we were facing what appeared to be a serious mechanical problem that would require significant time and effort to resolve. Upon closer investigation of my truck's condition, Ben confirmed that the vehicle needed some major repairs that would take several hours to complete properly. Feeling completely stranded in the middle of nowhere with no immediate transportation options available, all we could do was wait patiently for backup assistance from our company's headquarters while trying to make the best of an inconvenient situation. However, our conversation soon took a decidedly morbid turn when we both noticed an abandoned building located just down the road from where we were parked. The structure practically screamed danger and abandonment, with its numerous shattered windows and partially collapsed roof creating an ominous silhouette against the darkening sky. As curious as we both were to explore this mysterious building further and perhaps uncover some interesting local history, our sensible sixth sense warned us strongly against venturing any closer to what was obviously a potentially dangerous location. I commented cautiously that the building appeared to have once been some kind of meat processing plant, based on its industrial architecture and the various pieces of equipment that were still visible through the broken windows. I couldn't begin to imagine what tragic circumstances had led to its abandonment, but the atmosphere surrounding the place felt genuinely unsettling. As we continued discussing the possibility of tracking down any available information regarding the building's enigmatic history, we kept ourselves busy by hauling tools out of my truck and organizing our equipment while killing time until help would eventually arrive from headquarters. However, during this otherwise mundane task, we suddenly heard distinct rustling sounds that cut through the eerie silence. We exchanged increasingly uneasy glances, but initially passed off the noise as nothing more than some small animal moving through the underbrush that surrounded the abandoned property. That relatively innocent explanation lasted only until we caught sight of a peculiar silhouette moving deliberately out of the corner of our eyes, and panic immediately kicked our nervous systems into high alert. Both of us started sweating profusely despite the cold night air, and our hearts began racing as we tried to process what we were actually seeing. The figure appeared to be quite tall and heavily built, wearing what looked like an old, blood-stained apron that suggested some connection to the abandoned meat processing facility nearby. At first, this mysterious individual appeared to be limping slowly toward our location, but he soon quickened his pace with an unsettling sense of determination that suggested we had somehow attracted his unwanted attention. Our survival instincts immediately kicked into gear as adrenaline began pumping through our veins like high-voltage electricity. We scrambled quickly back toward the relative safety of my truck, yanking the driver's side door open and preparing to take refuge inside the cab, terrified and completely unable to come up with any rational explanation for this man's violent behavior and obvious hostile intentions. We decided against confronting him directly, since we didn't have adequate weapons to defend ourselves. Instead, we mustered enough courage to shout a desperate warning, demanding to know who he was and what he wanted from us. However, the figure didn't even acknowledge our desperate plea and simply seemed more determined than ever to reach our location, as if he had decided that we had spotted his secret lair and now needed to be silenced permanently to protect his dark activities. Story 17. The Collector. My name is Eldridge Marfield, though my friends have always called me Edge due to the unusual nature of my given name. And while I enjoy the various perks of truck driving, such as seeing new places across the United States, I never expected that one particular assignment would lead me into the most terrifying experience of my entire life. Today's drive seemed unlikely to offer anything particularly new or exciting, since I had already made this trip through rural Alabama literally hundreds of times before, without encountering anything more dangerous than the occasional aggressive driver or unexpected weather condition. However, as time passed and the picturesque landscape shifted from verdant greens to vibrant oranges and reds, signaling autumn's arrival in all its glory, I began to sense that something was different about this journey. I decided to pull into a rest stop where an old wooden house stood in obvious disrepair next to a pond that had turned stagnant over time, creating an atmosphere that immediately made the hair on my arms stand on end. There was definitely something deeply unsettling about this particular place that I couldn't quite identify or rationalize. My conversation with Fred over the radio confirmed that nobody had taken responsibility for maintaining that old property, and he speculated that it would probably cost more money to make the structure habitable again than it would to simply tear it down completely and start over with new construction. I watched the house intently for a moment before getting back into my truck to continue my journey, dismissing it as nothing more than idle curiosity about abandoned properties. It wasn't until I approached a small town and spotted something genuinely alarming that everything changed dramatically. Across the street from an old convenience store that was overlooked by an antique water tower, I witnessed a woman draped in ragged clothing who was screaming with absolute terror. as she desperately tried to escape from her captor. This individual was holding her arm tightly and appeared to be a large, heavily tattooed man who was clearly deranged, based on his wild eyes and the terrifying grin that was twisted across his face. My heart began thundering in my chest as I brought my truck to a screeching halt, knowing that what had started as an ordinary day was suddenly being thrust into chaos and danger. The woman looked directly at me as if pleading for her life, crying out desperately for someone to do something to help her escape from this obviously dangerous situation. I grabbed my tire iron without hesitation and charged at the man. He immediately released his grip on the woman's arm, causing her to crumble to the ground, and in what seemed like the blink of an eye, he turned to face me with a fierce gaze that radiated pure malevolence. His teeth were clenched in fury, and he managed to knock the tire iron out of my hand with remarkable speed and strength that seemed almost superhuman. I was able to land one solid punch before everything went completely black as his fist connected with my face with tremendous force. When my vision finally returned and the world came back into focus, I discovered that I was trapped inside a small cage that had been constructed from rusted metal bars, with an old padlock holding the door securely shut. My wrists and ankles were bound painfully tight with coarse rope that cut into my skin with every movement I made. Looking around this dimly lit warehouse space, I realized with growing horror that there were dozens of other people in similar situations, all trapped in their own individual cages and scattered throughout the building. Some of these unfortunate prisoners were moaning softly in pain or crying quietly to themselves, while others simply stared blankly ahead in what appeared to be a state of shock or complete resignation to their fate. I whispered urgently to a young man who was confined in the cage directly beside mine, asking how long he had been held captive in this nightmarish place. He replied weakly that it had been several days, though his voice was completely drained of hope and energy. He explained that their captor never spoke to any of his victims, but would periodically enter the warehouse and select one of the prisoners before taking them away to an unknown fate. Most disturbing of all, none of those who were taken away ever returned to tell what had happened to them. The faint scent of gasoline began to fill the air around us as we heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw roaring to life. Somewhere outside our immediate confinement area, blood-curdling screams soon joined this mechanical noise, confirming our worst fears about what was happening to those who had been selected for removal from their cages. As our captor approached my particular cage, I braced myself for what could very well be my final moments on Earth. However, instead of selecting me for whatever terrible fate awaited the others, he simply paused for a moment while his cold eyes analyzed me with calculating precision, then moved on to choose a different victim from among the terrified prisoners surrounding us. Story 18. The Convoy Terror. My name is Clifford Barkley, and I work as a truck driver residing in the small town of Weiser, Idaho, where I have lived for most of my adult life. Everything seemed perfectly normal on what appeared to be just another lousy Thursday morning as I picked up my designated load and set out on the road, completely unaware of how dramatically and brutally my life would be transformed by the events that were about to unfold. Initially, the drive proved to be entirely uneventful, filled with chatty radio hosts, sharing their characteristically lame jokes and long stretches of open road passing by my windows as I hauled goods across America just like any other day. However, Soon enough, a truly gory and inciting incident took place on a small stretch of highway just outside Boise that would serve as the catalyst for everything that followed. A mangled deer lay squished on the asphalt, with its internal organs stretched across the freeway, like some horrific abstract painting that seemed designed to disturb anyone who witnessed it. The gruesome sight immediately made me anxious to forget this disturbing scene and continue with my journey. So I decided to make a stop at a roadside diner sometime after midnight. My plan was simply to grab a cup of coffee and perhaps share a joke or two with another weary traveler. Since these brief human connections often help break up the monotony and isolation of long-distance driving, upon entering the brightly lit space, everything initially looked exactly like any other typical American diner you might find along the interstate highway system. However, this sense of normalcy was immediately shattered when I noticed a man sitting at the counter who was wearing dirty denim overalls and huddled over his coffee cup with an intensely focused concentration. His menacing appearance sent immediate shivers down my spine, as deep scars crisscrossed his face in a pattern that was reminiscent of a grotesquely carved pumpkin. The stranger's unsettling smirk sent a wave of profound unease washing over me like a cold tide. And for reasons that only stubborn and foolishly brave men can rationalize, I decided to sit next to him anyway. I was acting as if nothing could possibly disturb my equilibrium, though I'm not sure whether to call this decision bravado or sheer stupidity on my part. Just as I was about to deliver one of my famous icebreaker jokes in an attempt to lighten the oppressive atmosphere, a palpable sense of terror gripped me and forced me into complete silence. There was something oddly familiar about this individual, as if I might have encountered him before, or seen his face in some dark dream whose details had been hastily forgotten upon waking. It wasn't until he casually asked me about who I had been chatting with on my phone just moments earlier that a chilling realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. This had to be the serial killer from recent news reports and those frantic neighborhood rumors that had been circulating. The one who specifically preyed on unsuspecting truck drivers just like myself. My heart literally caught in my throat as nausea drained all color from my face, and it became almost impossible not to recognize him once I made this terrifying connection. The man's attention seemed to shift away from me for a few crucial moments, providing me with what might be my only opportunity to excuse myself and make a desperate dash toward the restroom. While trying to catch my breath and calm my racing pulse in the relative privacy of the bathroom, I frantically pondered my extremely limited options for escape. Was there enough time remaining to call the police before he became suspicious of my prolonged absence? Would he even still be present in the diner when law enforcement officers eventually arrived to investigate my report? My hands were shaking uncontrollably as anxiety threatened to completely paralyze me with indecisive terror. As precious seconds continued ticking away, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the bathroom door, and a pounding fear began collecting in my chest like a physical weight that made breathing increasingly difficult. I forced myself not to make any sound and carefully slipped into one of the bathroom stalls, hoping that I could somehow avoid detection until this immediate threat had passed. That's when I heard his eerie laughter filling the small room, and the sound turned my blood as cold as ice, while confirming that my worst fears about this situation were completely justified. The eerie laughter continued echoing through the bathroom for what felt like an eternity. and I knew beyond any shadow of doubt that I had to take some kind of decisive action to escape from this nightmarish situation, struggling desperately to maintain my composure and control my panic. I began formulating what seemed like the only viable plan available to me under these terrifying circumstances. Story 19. The Smiling Devil. It was one of those ordinary Wednesday evening shifts when everything began, and despite the passage of time, I still cannot manage to shake those absolutely horrifying memories out of my mind completely. My name is Jasper Callahan, and I work as a truck driver who has always maintained a knack for keeping things lighthearted and cracking jokes whenever situations become particularly tense or stressful. That particular day started off in a perfectly ordinary fashion with my usual stop at Bucky's Diner, located in rural Mississippi, to unload some supplies that I had been transporting across state lines. The staff members were consistently friendly and welcoming, and the establishment itself wasn't too shabby for a convenient pit stop during those inevitably long hauls that define our profession. As I finished up my business and prepared to get back on the road to continue toward my final destination, it didn't take very long for me to realize that something was definitely not right about the overall atmosphere and general circumstances. There had been several disturbing reports circulating among drivers about a mysterious presence that was apparently terrorizing truck drivers, specifically during their night shifts. Fellow drivers had been sharing increasingly disturbing stories about encounters with a brutal-looking man who possessed bloodshot eyes and wore an unsettling grin that seemed permanently etched across his face. His motivations remained completely unknown and unpredictable, but as the saying goes, truckers have accumulated more tales and stories than Shakespeare could ever have written in 1,000 years. Before I fully understood what was happening, dusk began to settle around the landscape like an unwelcome guest, wrapping its cold arms around everything in sight and creating an oppressive atmosphere. The familiar, comforting hum of my big rig's engine provided a steady rhythm as I traveled down the nearly empty highway, while the sun gradually bowed out for the evening. A heavy fog began rolling over the road as I passed through a densely wooded area that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Soon enough, my GPS navigation system alerted me that I needed to turn down an old country road that proved to be unusually narrow and very poorly lit, creating exactly the kind of scenario that horror movies typically use as their opening scenes. I couldn't help but chuckle nervously to myself as I maneuvered down this newfound path, thinking that nothing could have adequately prepared me for the sight that lay ahead of me. Strewn across the road in a deliberate pattern were plastic bags filled with glass shards and pieces of rotting flesh that created a macabre scene unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Horrified by this absolutely gruesome display, I immediately stopped my truck and leaped out of the cab to get a better look at everything that was spread before me. Curiosity poked at my consciousness like thousands of rusty fishhooks, while fear responded from deep within by screaming at me to flee this location immediately and never look back. My radio suddenly crackled to life, cutting through the oppressive silence with the sound of a deep and thoroughly sinister laugh that seemed to emerge from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. I frantically tried to establish contact with our dispatcher or any other drivers who might be monitoring our frequency, but no one seemed to be available to respond to my increasingly desperate calls. It felt like I was completely alone with this eerie and malevolent presence that was clearly toying with me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. Suddenly, a powerful engine roared in the distance, approaching my location at a spine-chilling pace that suggested whoever was driving had no regard for safety or traffic regulations. Before I could react appropriately or take any defensive measures, a battered truck tore through the fog with blinding headlights bearing down on me like some kind of relentless mechanical beast. I dove out of the way just in time to avoid being struck, as shattered glass and debris rained down on the exact spot where I had been standing only moments before. My instincts screamed at me that it was definitely time to clear out of this increasingly dangerous area. So I scrambled back into my rig and gunned the engine while my paranoia reached peak levels. My radio continued taunting me with that sinister laughter that made my skin crawl with revulsion and fear, while the narrow country road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, boxing me in on all sides. Moments later, I spotted some lights reflected in my side mirror, indicating that another truck was following closely behind me through the darkness. The driver appeared disheveled and disturbed under the dim light of his cab, matching exactly the descriptions that other drivers had provided about this legendary figure that had been terrorizing our community. Story 20. The Pursuit. My name is Ethan Harrington, and I never thought that my career as a truck driver would put me in the terrifying situation that I'm about to describe in detail. It was what I considered to be an ordinary day like any other, and my scheduled route was taking me across the beautiful state of California, from the vibrant and bustling city of Los Angeles all the way to the mystical redwood forests up north. The sun had already begun to disappear behind the horizon when I pulled up to a sleepy truck stop, seeking some much-needed rest after hours spent behind the wheel. With my back throbbing painfully from the extended period of sitting in the driver's seat, I eagerly hopped out of my cab, desperate to stretch my legs and work out some of the stiffness that had accumulated during the drive, when I heard a loud cracking sound nearby that resembled the snapping of bones. A distinct shiver ran through my entire body, and my previous concerns about back pain suddenly seemed completely insignificant in comparison. In an instant, the entire parking lot fell silent, and all of us drivers who had stopped for various reasons ceased our conversations mid-sentence. While scanning the area uneasily, we attempted to laugh nervously and brush off the disturbing sound as someone dropping something sizable or perhaps splitting firewood at one of the nearby campsites. Since nothing particularly sinister had ever happened in this neck of the woods before, still feeling uneasy about the unexplained noise, I tried to reassure myself by thinking that perhaps it was just routine campground activity. I joked with another driver as we entered the diner that was attached to the truck stop, commenting that there was never a dull day in our profession. Bizarrely, that oddly loud sound had somehow drawn us closer together as strangers united in solidarity, and laughter came easily as we traded stories over coffee and questionable lasagna before eventually heading back out into the night. However, one unusual sound seemed to lead to another, and the cacophony of small animals scuttling across hidden paths became sudden and tense, filling our steps with an unknown weight. Even after we left our newfound acquaintances inside the diner, as I climbed back into my truck cab, with recitations of Drive Safe ringing hollow in my ears, my gut instinct prevented me from starting the engine immediately. My breathing became shallow in the silent darkness, and this gradually intensified into a feeling of impending doom that I couldn't ignore or rationalize away. It took me only a moment to decide that I couldn't just sit there unprotected and helpless. So I fumbled around in my glove compartment for my weathered pocket knife, hoping it might provide some measure of security. Something sinister was lurking at the edge of my peripheral vision, positioned a bit further down the row of trucks and trailers, though I could only see a blur of movement. Whoever or whatever was out there neither moved nor spoke. And while it's easy to rationalize away fear under normal circumstances, somehow that shadow felt impossibly and bone-chillingly wrong. One of the figures stepped from between the shadows that were cast by a row of tires on a parked truck and began moving toward my location with slow and deliberate purpose. From the fleeting glimpse I managed to get, I could discern oddly angled limbs. But I had no time to process this information as I fumbled with the knife handle in my trembling hands. In an instant, 2 more figures joined their partner, and they all moved with unwavering purpose and frightening speed that suggested they were working together as a coordinated team. Now that our eyes had met, and they knew I was aware of their presence, my heart began pounding wildly while my fingers finally managed to grip the handle of the knife properly. Just as I stood from my seat to lock the cab door and secure myself inside, a 4th figure appeared on the scene. This one was noticeably taller than the others, and in that moment, I knew there was no further room for escape or denial of what was happening. These twisted shadows weren't just illusions triggered by exhaustion and paranoia. They were deadly real, and they were definitely coming for me. Desperation filled every fiber of my being as I briefly considered trying to start up my truck and flee this nightmare before it could reach me. However, even if my hands weren't shaking violently from fear, and even if these figures didn't seem to possess impossibly swift movement capabilities, I realized that I couldn't hide from this threat anymore. Story 21. The Highway Predator. I was taking a deep breath and relishing the freedom of being out on the open road when everything suddenly became weird in ways I never could have anticipated. My name is Clyde Hennessy, and I'm not usually someone who allows fear to get the better of me, especially after spending years as a truck driver zigzagging across this vast nation and encountering my fair share of oddities along the way. Tonight felt different, even for someone with my extensive experience dealing with unusual situations and strange people. As I muttered to myself while locking my cab and trying to make myself feel more at ease, I reminded myself that I had been through much worse situations during my career and had always managed to come out safely on the other side. An unusual scent filled the air around me, slightly metallic and mixed with something pungent that I couldn't immediately identify. The moon shone clearly in the night sky, casting eerie shadows on the cracked concrete lot where I had parked my rig for what I hoped would be a peaceful night's rest. I started to head toward a local diner for some coffee and food, taking slow strides past an unfamiliar alleyway that I had never noticed during previous visits to this area. As I walked, I stumbled upon a discovery that sent shivers down my spine and made me question whether I should continue or immediately return to my truck. There was a shoe with some drops of what appeared to be fresh blood on it, and before I could fully process what this might mean, a blood-curdling scream from an unseen source suddenly shattered the silence of the night. Frantically covering my ears, I looked around at every corner, feeling vulnerable yet completely unsure of what action I should take next. That's when something particularly peculiar caught my attention. A figure draped entirely in black was making its way toward me with deliberate steps. It appeared to be a man, however. There was something terribly wrong about his overall appearance and the way he moved through the darkness. This was a tall individual with wide shoulders that were slumped forward, and his elongated arms swung ominously with each step he took in my direction. My instincts immediately told me to run for help or call for backup, but strangely enough, something within me held me back from alerting others or making a scene that could potentially bring trouble upon myself. The closer he came, the more details I could make out about his disturbing appearance. His eyes gleamed with obvious ill intent beneath an unkempt mop of greasy hair, and his black attire was stained with blood and some unknown filth that was beyond my comprehension and imagination. As he reached within inches of my position, a particularly rancid smell emanated from his direction, and I instinctively knew that calling for help in this situation would be completely irrational, since it was already too late to change anything. Why waste my energy on what seemed to be inevitable at this point? A toothy smile then emerged from that demonic visage, and as shivers shook my entire body, I studied his face more carefully. It was clearly not normal, yet disturbingly familiar, bearing obvious marks of violence and trauma. It suddenly dawned upon me that this could be him, the notorious Christopher Franco, who was infamous for his vile and sadistic crimes. The gruesome stories I had heard about Franco floated back into my memory like fragments of a nightmare. Ordinary people had been left maimed and terrified in his wake, with their limbs twisted and distorted beyond any hope of repair. His putrid breath fanned across my face, sending beads of perspiration down my neck as he leaned in close. He whispered menacingly into my ear that he had been waiting for me specifically, and I felt terror surge through my body like a tidal wave. In a feeble attempt to resist whatever horrible fate Franco was about to unleash upon me, I swung my fist at him, only to have him catch it flawlessly with reflexes that seemed almost supernatural. As I tried desperately to free myself from his vice-like grip, I struggled with all the strength I could muster, but it felt hopeless and completely futile. Distorted laughter erupted from beneath the shadows that surrounded us, and Franco raised his other arm high above both of us with obvious, malicious intent. His arm came down with inconceivable force, and as I twisted frantically to avoid the impact, I realized that the blow didn't bring the pain I was expecting. Instead, it sent me sprawling onto the cold, hard ground, where I found myself grasping desperately at my fading senses, while still reeling from the shock of the attack. Story 22. The Radio Stalker. My name is Garrison Hendrick, and people often think that truck driving is a dull and monotonous profession. But we drivers frequently create our own little adventures to keep ourselves entertained during those long stretches of highway that can seem to go on forever. Little did I know that soon enough I would find myself experiencing a real-life nightmare that would prove to be far more terrifying than any adventure I could have possibly imagined. It all began during one of my typical runs through Las Cruces, New Mexico. While I was making a routine pit stop for gas and some snacks at a rundown convenience store that seemed to be hanging on by a thread, while making my purchases inside the dimly lit establishment, I noticed an elderly woman with a distinctly frantic look etched across her weathered face. She appeared extremely disheveled and kept glancing around nervously, as if she was constantly being watched by some unseen presence that filled her with obvious dread and anxiety. I tried to strike up a friendly conversation with her, asking gently if everything was all right, and whether there was anything I could do to help her with whatever was troubling her. To my surprise, she responded with both fear and urgency, clearly resonating in her trembling voice. She warned me earnestly that I needed to watch out around this particular area, explaining that there was someone dangerous lurking nearby, who was always watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike unsuspecting travelers like myself. With the urgency of her words still lingering heavily in my mind as I reluctantly left the store to continue on my scheduled route, I couldn't help but notice that the hair on the back of my neck seemed to be standing on end. It felt as if my body was instinctively responding to some threat that my conscious mind hadn't yet fully recognized or understood. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and I continued crossing the empty expanse of desert highway, the typical New Mexico night settled around me like a heavy blanket. However, tonight felt different somehow, as if there was an additional layer of unease pressing down on the already oppressive sensation of isolation that comes with driving through such remote areas. Even with the radio turned up to full volume in an attempt to drown out my growing anxiety, something sinister seemed to be lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The crackle of my CB radio suddenly interrupted my increasingly troubled thoughts, catching me completely off guard as an unexpected transmission broke through the static. A deep voice started speaking through the radio waves, and the sound was distorted and disturbingly inhuman in its quality and tone. My instinctive reaction was to turn off the radio immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this mysterious communication might somehow be connected to what the elderly woman had been trying to warn me about earlier. As the night wore on relentlessly, the isolation only grew more suffocating, and the atmosphere seemed to become heavier and more oppressive with each mile I traveled deeper into the desert. The darkness felt almost alive somehow, pressing against the windows of my cab, like something trying desperately to get inside and reach me. Suddenly, in the distance ahead, I spotted what appeared to be a car that had been abandoned on the side of the road, with its single remaining headlight cutting through the darkness with an unnatural intensity that seemed almost supernatural. Unable to suppress my curiosity despite my growing sense of unease about the entire situation, I hesitantly stepped out of my truck to investigate more closely. The steady hum of my idling engine suddenly felt like a vital lifeline connecting me to safety and civilization. As I nervously approached the mysterious vehicle under the vast canopy of stars that stretched endlessly across the desert sky, upon closer inspection, I discovered an unsettling sight that made my blood run cold with terror. There was a clear trail of what appeared to be fresh blood leading from the driver's seat of the abandoned car and extending into the desert, disappearing into the darkness among the sagebrush and scattered desert vegetation that dotted the landscape. In any rational situation, I should have immediately turned back and contacted the authorities at that very moment. However, something seemed to compel me forward into the unknown, as if there was some indescribable force pushing me deeper into the desert night against every logical thought in my head and all my better judgment about personal safety and common sense. Story 23: The Warehouse Horror. My name is Colin Jonathan, and I work as a truck driver, though I've always admired those comedians who possess the remarkable ability to turn even the most mundane experiences into something genuinely hilarious and entertaining. Just the other day, a bird managed to leave its mark on my windshield, and I found myself wondering why they always seem to aim specifically for the driver's side, as if they're deliberately trying to obstruct our vision. It was one of those completely uneventful days when I pulled into a rest area located somewhere in Iowa, seeking a much-needed break from the monotonous rhythm of highway driving. The rest area seemed to be exactly what you would expect from such a place. People coming and going with their families, truckers stopping for quick meals and brief naps, and the general atmosphere of travelers taking temporary refuge from their journeys. As I made my way toward the restroom facilities, I noticed an older gentleman sitting alone on a bench, and his appearance immediately caught my attention because he looked incredibly pale and disoriented. He appeared to be in some kind of distress, almost as if he had been through something particularly strenuous or frightening that had left him visibly shaken and confused. Had it been any other day or any other location, I might have stopped to check on his well-being and offer assistance. But something about the overall atmosphere of this place made me hesitant to get involved in situations that might not concern me directly. Nonetheless, the image of this man's haggard state continued to stay with me as I tried to push it out of my mind and focus on my own business. After washing up and grabbing a hot cup of coffee from one of the vending machines to help keep me alert for the remainder of my journey, I made my way back toward my truck where I knew Troy, a fellow trucker and good friend, would be meeting up with me soon. As we settled down at a picnic table and began to catch up on our recent exploits and experiences on the road, we heard several loud bangs in quick succession. A split second later, shouts followed by an eerie and unsettling silence filled the air around us, creating an atmosphere of tension that neither of us could ignore or explain away as coincidence. This individual's sunken eyes peered menacingly at us from beneath matted hair that looked like it hadn't been washed or maintained in months, and their overall appearance suggested someone who had been living rough for an extended period. Troy and I decided to return to our trucks without saying a word to each other. There was something innately unsettling about this mysterious person that triggered all our survival instincts, and we didn't want to stick around long enough to find out what kind of danger they might represent. We were driving along the highway when we noticed flashing lights from an ambulance up ahead, and as we got closer, I could see more clearly the gruesome scene that emergency responders were dealing with. The older man from the rest stop was lying motionless on the ground next to several other people, some of whom had suffered terrible injuries that suggested a violent attack had taken place. With all that had transpired between our departure from the rest area and discovering this horrific scene, their presence during our brief encounter seemed even more sinister and threatening than it had at the time. We couldn't shake the persistent feeling that some unseen force was somehow watching us from afar, and that sensation only intensified when we noticed that several other drivers who shared our profession seemed to be going through similar experiences. Perhaps it was naive optimism or simply seasoned trepidation that kept me from immediately calling for help. But my instincts suggested this wasn't the work of some random assailant. Rather, we appeared to be dealing with an individual who possessed a rare and disturbing capacity for violence. Someone who had made truck drivers and rest areas their particular hunting ground. As eerie as everything sounded when we discussed it, there was no way to prove any of our suspicions without coming across as overly paranoid drivers spinning wild tales over cups of coffee late at night. We both decided to carry on with our scheduled routes and simply remain more vigilant than usual, making sure we never spent too long lingering at any stops along our respective journeys. A week later, I had almost forgotten about those strange and disturbing occurrences when I found myself passing through Iowa once again, not by any choice of my own, but rather by assignment from my dispatcher. Out of sheer curiosity, or perhaps some kind of morbid fascination, I decided to detour back to the original rest stop where everything had begun. As I pulled into the parking lot, the scene was eerily reminiscent of that fateful day, and I felt the same sense of unease washing over me as I stepped out of my truck and looked around at the familiar surroundings. Troy's voice called out from behind me, and I turned to see him pulling his rig right beside mine, his eyes meeting mine with an unspoken understanding that we were about to face whatever dangers awaited us with the kind of shared courage that can only come from true friendship forged through countless miles on the road together. Story 24. The Midnight Encounter. My name is Archibald O'Connor, but everyone calls me Archie, and I'm a truck driver who has crisscrossed the United States more times than I can accurately count during my years in this profession. One aspect of my job that I particularly appreciate is the opportunity to discover Lucerno, American towns, and experience the unique character that each community possesses. One such occasion took me through Grimesville, a small and seemingly unremarkable town that was nonetheless home to some genuinely good folks who welcomed travelers with warmth and hospitality. I was hauling a load of supplies from the East Coast, and it was around midnight when I finally pulled into Grimesville, feeling the fatigue that had settled deep in my bones after many hours behind the wheel. I decided to grab something to eat from the local diner before finding a suitable place to park for the night and get some much-needed rest. As I walked into the establishment, I immediately locked eyes with a peculiar individual who was sitting at the far end of the diner, occupying a booth in the shadows. This was a disheveled man who appeared to be in his 40s, maybe 5'6" in height, with unkempt facial hair that suggested he hadn't groomed himself properly in quite some time. He wore a dirty beige overcoat that had seen better days, and he emitted a pungent odor that wafted toward me every time he shifted position in his seat, despite noticing him immediately upon entering the diner. The man didn't seem particularly noteworthy at first glance, just another down-in-his-luck individual seeking shelter and perhaps a warm meal. However, something outlandish suddenly caught my peripheral vision that would change my entire perception of this seemingly harmless encounter. In one swift and deliberate motion, he discreetly slid what appeared to be a black trash bag under his table, handling it with the kind of careful precision that suggested its contents were either valuable or dangerous. With so many strange things happening across this country on a regular basis, I had learned not to burden myself with other people's business unless it directly affected my safety. Shrugging off the oddness of this behavior, I took my usual spot at the counter and ordered a burger with fries from Marilyn, the chatty waitress who seemed to be working the night shift alone. She could immediately tell that something was bothering me and asked if everything was all right, displaying the kind of genuine concern that you often find in small-town establishments. I replied with what I hoped was a reassuring grin, though I couldn't help but glance uncertainly toward the strange man while explaining that I was just wondering about that particular customer. Marilyn leaned in closer and whispered cautiously that he came into the diner quite often during the late-night hours, explaining that they weren't supposed to serve him officially. However, she admitted that sometimes she would sneak him something small to eat, knowing that he didn't have much money and seemed to be genuinely struggling with difficult circumstances. My curiosity was definitely piqued by this information, and I found myself wondering who this mysterious individual could be that would inspire such sympathy from the staff. As I reluctantly continued eating my meal while trying to mind my own business, my phone suddenly began to ring, and it was my brother Vincent calling to catch up on our usual topics of conversation. We talked about family matters, sports, and the latest movies we had seen. But as our conversation began to wind down, we heard a loud thud coming from behind us in the diner. The strange man had accidentally knocked the trash bag out from under his table in his apparent haste to leave the establishment quickly, and as he scrambled desperately to pick up the fallen bag and make a beeline for the exit, something horrifying fell out of it onto the floor. What we witnessed was so disturbing and repulsive that I nearly choked on my food, a blood-drenched lump of meat that appeared, unmistakably, to be a human hand. Our eyes widened in utter shock and disbelief as we all stared at this gruesome evidence for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds before anyone could react appropriately or take any kind of action. The man grabbed the severed appendage and sprinted out the door, disappearing into the night like some kind of supernatural entity. The diner immediately became awash with panic and confused voices, and I knew instinctively that I had to do something to help catch this obviously dangerous individual. I quickly finished my phone call with Vincent, explaining that something terrible had happened and that I would call him back later. Then I hung up and looked at the frightened faces of everyone around me, not wanting to waste any precious time that might allow this criminal to escape justice. I immediately jumped into action, forgetting completely about my fatigue and the late hour. I exited the diner and began searching frantically for any trace of the strange man who had just fled the scene with what was clearly evidence of a serious crime. Story 25. The Final Hunt. My name is Rob, and I've been driving these highways for more years than I care to remember, but nothing could have prepared me for the encounter that would forever change how I view the road ahead. It was a particularly cold evening when I tipped my trucker cap to the waitress at a truck stop diner and made my way back to my rig, which I had affectionately named Sir Hololot after all the miles we had traveled together. I checked a thoughtful message on my phone from my wife, Kayla, who was wishing me a safe trip back home, and her words filled me with the warm comfort that only comes from knowing someone truly cares about your well-being. As I hopped into my cab and settled in for another stretch of highway, I reached for my radio to connect with Steve, another trucker who was traveling in the opposite direction, about 60 miles away. Steve responded to my call with his characteristic good humor, and when I mentioned that I was passing through Pickettville and wondered if he knew anything interesting about the area, he chuckled briefly with obvious familiarity. He informed me that I was currently in what locals sometimes called Blair Witch territory, and we both shared a laugh about the reference to that famous horror movie. We agreed to reconnect once I had completed my current route, and as night crept in around me, I headed northbound toward Hagerstown, Maryland. The atmosphere felt unusually heavy that evening, and a dense fog began to envelop the road, obscuring a significant portion of what lay ahead and forcing me to drive with increased caution and reduced speed. Deciding that I needed a little pick-me-up to maintain my alertness, I radioed my dispatcher Jim with one of my typical jokes, asking why a bicycle couldn't stand up by itself. After a brief pause, during which I could practically hear him rolling his eyes, he grumbled back, asking for the punchline, and I delivered it with enthusiasm, explaining that it was because the bicycle was too tired. Jim groaned in response to my wordplay and returned to his duties, managing the fleet of drivers scattered across the country. But I could tell he appreciated the brief moment of levity in what was otherwise a routine evening. It wasn't long after that conversation that things began to take a strange and increasingly ominous turn that would test every survival instinct the first possessed. My radio began cutting in and out periodically, and local transmissions started breaking through the static with news reports about an escaped murderer named Jonathan Atkins. The story immediately piqued my interest as they described him as extremely dangerous and unpredictable. Someone who targeted victims seemingly without any discernible pattern or logical motivation. I spotted an odd silhouette standing about 100 feet ahead on the road, emerging from the thick fog like something out of a nightmare. As I got closer to this mysterious figure, I could see that it was a man standing motionless in the middle of the traffic lane, completely drenched from head to toe and visibly shivering in the cold night air. Despite every instinct telling me to be cautious about stopping for strangers, especially given what I had just heard on the radio, I couldn't simply leave someone stranded in such dangerous conditions. I brought Sir Hollalot to a stop and approached the man through my partially lowered window, trying to sound as friendly and helpful as possible while maintaining a safe distance. The man was pale as the fog that surrounded us both, and when he spoke, his voice carried a desperate quality that seemed genuine enough. He explained that there had been an accident somewhere ahead and pleaded with me to help him, pointing toward a location that was obscured by the thick mist that had settled over the entire area. Skeptical but curious about the situation, I decided to pull my truck over to the side of the road and follow him to investigate what he claimed was an emergency. The air felt colder than ever as we continued walking into the murky fog, and my mind raced with various possibilities about what we might discover at our destination. An overturned car soon appeared ahead of us through the mist, with steam rising from its damaged engine like an eerie apparition that seemed to materialize from the very fog itself. Panic began to wash over me as we approached what appeared to be a genuine accident scene, and I found myself wondering if there might be injured passengers trapped inside, who desperately needed immediate medical attention. Suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing behind us through the disorienting fog, and when I turned around to locate the source of the sound, I discovered that the strange man who had been leading me to this location had completely vanished, without leaving any trace of where he might have gone. The realization hit me like a physical blow that I had been led into some kind of trap. A sense of dread unlike anything I had ever experienced before settled over me as I stood alone in that fog-shrouded landscape, knowing that somewhere in the mist around me lurked Jonathan Atkins, the escaped murderer whose reputation for violence and unpredictability had been haunting the local news broadcasts. The final hunt had begun, and I was no longer the hunter but the prey, alone on a desolate stretch of highway with only my wits and determination to see another sunrise. Story 26. The Vanishing Truck Stop. There's something unsettling about places that exist only when you need them most, only to disappear without a trace once you've escaped their grasp. I've been driving these highways for nearly 40 years, witnessing blizzards that could bury entire towns in Wyoming, navigating empty desert stretches in New Mexico, where the horizon seems to stretch into eternity, and creeping through fog so thick in Maine that your own headlights become useless. But nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever gotten under my skin quite like what I discovered in a truck stop basement off an old Ohio back road. I still don't know what that place truly was, and frankly, I'm not sure I want to know. All I can say with certainty is that I came dangerously close to disappearing forever into something that shouldn't exist. It was the evening of October 27th, 2008, one of those autumn nights when the cold creeps into your bones. Regardless of how high you've cranked the heat inside your cab, I was traveling west on Route 30, having just passed Worcester, with about 3 hours of driving still ahead of me. My fuel gauge was practically kissing empty, and my eyes were beginning to blur from the strain of staring at endless stretches of blacktop. I hadn't encountered another rig in over an hour, just an endless parade of trees and cornfields, long winding roads cutting through forgotten farmland that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Then, like a mirage materializing from the misty air, I spotted a sign glowing in the distance. It was a tall, flickering neon sign that seemed to be barely holding on to life itself, reading Rest Easy Truck Stop, open 24 hours. At the time, it felt like salvation appearing just when I needed it most. I had no idea I was actually pulling into something far more sinister than a simple roadside stop. The parking lot was severely cracked, with weeds growing wild at the edges, looking as though they hadn't been trimmed in at least a decade. An old diesel pump leaned sideways at an odd angle, as if it had been struck by a truck long ago and simply left to decay. I parked my rig near what appeared to be the diner section and stepped out into the night. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and still, carrying with it that peculiar smell you notice near abandoned buildings, a mixture of mildew, rust, and something indefinably wrong that makes your instincts scream warnings. When I opened the door, I was hit with a blast of warm air that somehow failed to provide any comfort. Instead, it made me deeply nervous. The interior felt like stepping backward through time into the 1970s. Yellowed fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered constantly overhead. The walls were paneled with fake wood that had become greasy and warped in spots over the years. Near the entrance sat a rack of dusty road maps and a gumball machine that looked as though it hadn't been refilled in years. There was no music playing, no television humming, no sound of conversation, just the mechanical hum of a cooler motor and the incessant buzzing of those trapped fluorescent lights. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his late 40s, though his weathered skin suggested he'd lived twice that long. He was thin and unnaturally tall, pale as a ghost, wearing a moth-eaten sweater that hung off his shoulders as if it no longer fit properly. But what truly disturbed me wasn't his appearance, it was his smile. It was wide and unblinking, as if he'd been waiting specifically for me to walk through that door. "You look beat," he said, his voice rasping like sandpaper against wood. "We have rooms available, real cheap, downstairs. They're warm and quiet." When I asked if there was a motel nearby, he chuckled, as if I'd told him a joke. "Nothing around for miles. Friend, this is the best place you'll find. Safe to..." The way he emphasized the word safe made it sound like a warning disguised as an invitation. Against my better judgment, fatigue clouding my decision-making, I accepted the key he offered. It was attached to a bent metal tag reading Room 3. He nodded toward a heavy wooden door behind the counter, saying, "Just down those stairs." His smile stretched even wider, lasting far too long to be natural. The moment I opened that door, cold air poured out, thick with dampness and something else, something that smelled like decay beneath old concrete. The wooden stairs creaked ominously with each step as I descended into what felt increasingly like a tomb. Behind me, the door swung shut with a heavy final thud that seemed to seal my fate. The hallway at the bottom was damp and narrow, resembling a maintenance corridor in some long-abandoned asylum. The air felt thick and moldy, as if it hadn't been properly circulated in years. The walls were plain concrete, and the floor was dotted with puddles that splashed under my boots with each careful step. But what stopped me cold was the realization that all the locks were installed on the outside of the doors. When I noticed room 5's door standing slightly ajar, curiosity overcame caution. Inside was a tiny, windowless space containing only a single mattress on the floor, stained and torn, covered with what appeared to be burn marks. Then I saw them, chains bolted directly into the concrete floor. I ran up those stairs as hard as I could, every creaking board behind me sounding like pursuing footsteps. When I burst through the basement door, the clerk remained at his desk with that same frozen smile, though his eyes now held a different quality. Surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. "Forgot something?" he asked, as I walked past him without answering, moving fast but not running, refusing to give him the satisfaction. As I reached for the main door handle, I swear I heard him whisper, "You weren't supposed to leave." I spent that entire night in my locked cab, parked behind the building, never sleeping, just watching and waiting. Morning came like mercy itself, and when I looked up directions to the truck stop later, I found nothing. No record, no address, no reviews, as if it existed only for those unfortunate enough to stumble upon it. A week later, driving the same route, I slowed down to look for it again, but found only an empty concrete slab cracked with weeds, as if the entire place had been wiped from existence, waiting to reappear for the next tired, vulnerable traveler who wouldn't be missed. Story 27. The hitchhiker who never left. Some roads hold on to their stories like secrets buried deep in the asphalt, in the trees, in the fog that never seems to completely lift. There's a particular stretch of Route 33 that winds through the West Virginia Appalachians. I've been a long-haul trucker since I turned 21, covering nearly every state in this vast country. I've witnessed sunrises painting the Rockies in brilliant gold, weathered ice storms that turned the Dakotas into frozen wastelands, and watched tornadoes dance across the Texas plains. But nothing, absolutely nothing, ever rattled me quite like that night in October of 1997, when the ordinary became impossibly strange. Route 33 cuts straight through the heart of the Appalachians, and you might expect, being surrounded by those ancient mountains, to feel peaceful. It doesn't. It's the kind of place where the trees maintain an unnatural silence, as if they're listening intently to secrets they'll never share, as if they possess knowledge that would terrify ordinary mortals. The fog rolls in, thick and unpredictable there, seeming to move with its own mysterious purpose, as though the road itself wants to hide from the world. The air always carries the scent of rain, mixed with something rotting, something that's been decomposing in those hills for far longer than anyone should think about. That particular night, I was hauling a load of steel beams eastbound to Harrisonburg, Virginia. I'd left Charleston around 10 in the evening, foolishly thinking I could beat the fog that was already beginning to gather in the valleys. I should have known better after all my years on these roads. Around midnight, the mist began to thicken dramatically. Not the gentle kind that drifts low like morning fog, but something heavy and choking that seemed to cling to everything it touched. It swallowed the road ahead completely and erased the world behind me, as if I was driving through a void between dimensions. I turned off my high beams, which only made the situation worse. My headlights simply created a white glow, as if I was somehow driving underwater through an ocean of mist. I slowed my speed to 30 miles per hour, straining my eyes to see even a few feet ahead. That's when I first saw her, standing on the side of the road like an apparition from another era. Initially, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Thick fog can seriously mess with depth perception, creating illusions that seem absolutely real. But she was undeniably there, pale, unnaturally thin, completely soaked, despite the fact that it wasn't raining. Her dress appeared to be from another time entirely, flowing and lacy like something preserved in an old photograph that had somehow come to life. She walked slowly along the roadside, seeming uncertain of her destination, or perhaps simply not caring where the road might lead her. I pulled over carefully, my hazard lights blinking like warning beacons in the darkness, and rolled down my window. "You all right, ma'am?" I called out to her. She didn't respond immediately, but slowly turned her head to look directly at me. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to keep driving, to leave her standing there in the mist and fog. But I have a daughter of my own, and I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd want someone to do if they found her stranded on a lonely road in the middle of nowhere. So against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door and invited her inside. She climbed in without uttering a single word. No thank you, no explanation, no hesitation whatsoever. She simply opened the door, sat down in the passenger seat, and closed it behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. When I glanced over at her, I noticed she was soaked completely through to the bone. Her hair dripped steadily onto her dress, and her hands rested motionlessly in her lap, as if they belonged to a mannequin rather than a living person. I attempted to start some kind of conversation, asking where she was headed and if she was from the local area. Nothing. She offered no response whatsoever, just maintained that same empty stare straight ahead, as if the road itself was somehow pulling her forward toward some unknowable destination. We drove in complete silence for what felt like 10 miles, with only the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears to break the oppressive quiet. I kept glancing over at her periodically, hoping she might say something, even just a whisper to acknowledge my presence. But she continued staring ahead with that same vacant expression, as motionless as a statue. Then, just before we reached the curve near Hawk's Nest, I looked over one more time and discovered that the passenger seat was completely empty. No sound of an opening door, no movement, no indication of how she had vanished. 1 second she was sitting there, and the next moment, nothing but empty space. I slammed on the brakes so hard that my entire rig jerked violently forward. Tires squealed against the asphalt, and the cargo rattled loudly in the trailer behind me. I pulled onto the shoulder immediately and jumped out with my flashlight in hand, running up and down the road while calling into the mist. "Hey, lady, where did you go?" But nothing answered except the wind whistling through the trees. No footsteps, no voices, no sign that she had ever existed except for the passenger seat, which remained mysteriously damp. When I reached Harrisonburg around sunrise, I stopped at a small 24-hour diner off the highway. One of those places where the coffee is perpetually hot and the bacon is always slightly burnt. I must have looked like death itself, because the waitress raised an eyebrow before pouring me a cup. An old-timer sitting at the counter turned around. He wore a worn flannel shirt and had a white beard, with eyes like chips of ice that seemed to see right through you. "You saw Lacey," he said matter-of-factly, as if this was common knowledge that everyone should possess. He proceeded to tell me the story like it was local folklore. Lacey had been a young woman, a hitchhiker, who disappeared sometime during the 1970s. People said she'd been picked up by a stranger and never reached her intended destination. Her body was eventually found in a ravine off Route 33, her dress torn, walking barefoot through eternity. Ever since then, only truckers reported seeing her, always walking, always barefoot, always searching for something she would never find. I tried to laugh it off at the time, dismissing it as just another ghost story. But even now, all these years later, I've never driven Route 33 without glancing nervously at that passenger seat. Sometimes I feel the cold returning unexpectedly, hear the CB radio crackling with voices that cut out before I can respond, or notice the seatbelt pulled down just a little too tight, as if someone invisible is still riding along with me on these endless highways. Story 28. The Monster's Cargo. There are faces that burn themselves into your memory so deeply that they appear behind your eyelids decades later, as clear and vivid as the day you first encountered them. The face I still see sometimes when I close my eyes isn't screaming or crying, isn't twisted with rage or frozen in fear. It's disturbingly calm, far too calm for what I discovered that night. It belongs to a pale man, thin and unnaturally twitchy, who stood beside me under flickering lights at a god-forsaken truck stop in the middle of the Arizona desert. He politely asked for a cigarette, which I gave him without hesitation. We engaged in small talk for several minutes, and during that entire conversation, I had absolutely no idea that he had 3 human bodies stored in the back of his refrigerated truck. I've navigated my way through sandstorms that could strip paint from metal, ice storms that turned highways into skating rinks, and civil riots that made city streets look like war zones. But nothing, absolutely nothing, ever shook me to my core. Quite like what I discovered inside that freezer unit. The memory still haunts me, and perhaps it never would have happened if I hadn't been blessed and cursed with such damning curiosity about the world around me. It was July of 2003, during one of the hottest summers on record. I was hauling fresh produce from Salinas, California, all the way to Laredo, Texas. 1,200 miles of relentless heat, choking dust, and questionable truck stop coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous decade. That particular week, temperatures were pushing well into the 110s, and my rig's air conditioning system could barely keep up with the oppressive heat. Everything felt like it was melting. My hands on the steering wheel, the air itself, the entire world shimmering like an endless mirage stretching toward the horizon. I'd been driving for 9 straight hours without a significant break. My legs had gone stiff and numb. My eyes felt gritty from the constant wind and dust, and every muscle in my body ached from maintaining the same position for so long. My plan was relatively simple: pull over somewhere remote to fuel up, stretch my cramped limbs, grab something cold to drink, and crash for a few hours before making the final push into Texas. Just past the Arizona border, maybe 30 miles east of Quartzsite, I spotted exactly what I was looking for. If you had blinked while driving past, you would have missed it entirely. It was a half-dead truck stop, clinging desperately to life beside the interstate, like a sun-bleached carcass slowly decomposing in the sand. There was a single row of ancient fuel pumps, cracked pavement that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, and one flickering neon sign that claimed the place was open 24 hours, even though it appeared as though it hadn't been properly cleaned since the previous century. I remember thinking how utterly lifeless the entire place felt. Even the desert winds seemed to actively avoid the area, as if nature itself found something unsettling about the location. There were no insects buzzing around, no birds calling in the distance, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the scrub brush and the overwhelmingly suffocating heat that made everything feel surreal and dreamlike. I pulled my rig into the far end of the lot, near the dumpsters, and parked beside a row of other trucks. But one vehicle immediately stood out from the rest. A white box truck with no visible logo, no identifying markings of any kind, parked at an odd, crooked angle, as if whoever had left it there had been in a tremendous hurry, or simply didn't care about proper parking etiquette. As I stepped out of my cab and began stretching, my bones cracking audibly after the long haul, that's when I first noticed him. He emerged from around the mysterious box truck as if he'd been watching and waiting for me to arrive. He appeared to be in his early 30s, unnaturally skinny, with dirty blonde hair that was half-shaved in an uneven, amateur fashion. His clothes looked as though he'd been sleeping in them for days. Torn jeans, a stained gray hoodie zipped all the way up to his neck, despite the brutal heat. He walked with an awkward, uncomfortable gait, as if his shoes were several sizes too small, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot, like someone perpetually on edge. "Got a smoke?" he asked, his voice soft but somehow unnatural, as if he was carefully mimicking normal human behavior rather than speaking from genuine interaction. I handed him a cigarette without thinking twice about it, lit it for him, and we stood there in the oppressive silence. That's when I first became aware of the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come, a deep, guttural mechanical humming that seemed to drill directly into my ears and settle uncomfortably in my chest. The sound was coming from the freezer unit mounted on his box truck, running at full blast despite the late hour and extreme heat. Vents were pumping clouds of cold mist into the scorching night air, creating an almost supernatural contrast with the desert environment. Something about the entire situation struck me as fundamentally wrong. There were no commercial markings on the truck, no refrigerated cargo labels, no delivery tags or shipping manifests visible anywhere. It was simply a freezer unit running at maximum capacity in the middle of the desert, consuming enormous amounts of energy for no apparent reason. When I casually asked him what kind of cargo he was hauling, he paused for just a fraction of a second too long before responding. "Just moving some stuff that needs to stay cold," he said. But his eyes never quite met mine when he spoke. That freezer unit wasn't preserving food or legitimate cargo. I knew it instinctively, felt it deep in my gut, with the kind of certainty that comes from years of experience on the road. After he thanked me for the cigarette, flicked it away, and disappeared once again behind his truck, I stood there for several long minutes, debating with myself. I'd encountered sketchy situations before during my years of trucking. I'd witnessed obvious drug runs, and once in Louisiana, I'd even stumbled across what appeared to be illegal organ transport. But this felt different, more sinister, more fundamentally wrong than anything I'd previously encountered. I don't know what ultimately made me decide to investigate further. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, or maybe it was some deeper instinct screaming that something terrible was happening right in front of me. I walked over slowly and carefully, trying to appear casual. The back latch of the trailer wasn't secured with a lock, so I pulled it open without too much difficulty. The cold hit me first, a blast of frigid air that wrapped around me like death itself, so intense that it felt like stepping into another dimension entirely. Inside the trailer, everything was illuminated by a single flickering bulb that cast eerie shadows on the metallic walls, which were completely lined with thick frost. 3 heavy-duty black body bags were arranged on the floor like sleeping figures, sealed and ominous. One of them wasn't zipped completely closed, and despite every instinct telling me not to look, I found myself staring at what was partially visible inside. I saw a human foot, pale and discolored from prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures, with dark bruises visible around the ankle and what appeared to be a faint floral tattoo. The reality of what I was seeing hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, my breath immediately fogging in the contrast between the freezer air and the desert heat, slammed the doors shut, and nearly fell as I ran back to my truck, my hands shaking so violently that I dropped my phone twice while trying to dial 911. When the emergency dispatcher finally answered, I blurted out everything I'd witnessed: the white box truck with no identification, the possible human remains, the exact location, and the license plate number I'd managed to memorize. She asked if I was absolutely certain about what I'd seen, and I remember telling her clearly, "Lady, I just saw a dead woman's foot in a commercial freezer." The police eventually found him approximately 50 miles away near Benson. He didn't resist arrest or attempt to flee, just pulled over calmly as if it were a routine traffic stop. Inside his truck, they discovered 3 bodies, all young women. According to his confession, he'd met one of them through an online dating platform, while the other 2 had been hitchhikers he'd picked up along various highways. He confessed with the same disturbing calm he'd displayed when asking for that cigarette, explaining that he was taking them to a remote location where no one would ever find them, as if he genuinely believed he was performing some kind of service. It's been over 20 years since that night, but I still think about it regularly. I remember how naturally he smiled at me, how close I stood to that truck full of horror, how I almost walked away without investigating further. Sometimes I wonder how many other monsters I've shared cigarettes with over the years, how many seemingly normal conversations I've had with people harboring unimaginable darkness. But I also think about those 3 families who were able to find closure, who were able to bury their daughters properly instead of wondering forever what had happened to them. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourish. Sometimes it just politely asks for a cigarette and operates a freezer in the desert. Story 29. The Thing That Followed. Have you ever had someone look directly into your eyes and tell you something so bizarre, so completely outside the realm of normal experience, that your first instinct is to laugh dismissively, but then they don't laugh back, don't even crack a smile, don't blink or show any sign that they're joking. They just stare at you with the haunted expression of someone who has witnessed something no human being was ever meant to see. That was my co-driver Ben, back in the fall of 2016, and the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. We were halfway through what should have been a completely routine haul. A simple and straightforward job, running a standard route from Seattle all the way to North Dakota. Nothing about the assignment seemed unusual or particularly challenging. Just another long-distance run that we'd completed dozens of times before without incident. The only thing that might have been considered out of the ordinary was that particular stretch of highway outside Billings, Montana, where the woods grow unnaturally thick and dense, where all traces of civilization seem to vanish completely, and where the world around you feels like it's perpetually holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. That night fundamentally changed both of us in ways that neither of us could have anticipated. One of us left the trucking industry entirely and never returned, while the other, me, developed an absolute refusal to ever drive that specific stretch of highway again, especially during the dark hours when shadows play tricks on your mind. It was my designated turn to sleep, since we operated as team drivers, splitting the workload to maximize our efficiency and minimize downtime. I handled the day shifts when visibility was good and traffic was manageable, while Ben took responsibility for the night runs when the roads were typically clearer but required more intense concentration. We'd been working together in this arrangement for several years and had developed a comfortable rhythm that made these long hauls relatively manageable and even somewhat enjoyable. That particular night seemed no different from countless others. I crawled into the sleeper cab around 10 in the evening, pulled a well-worn blanket over myself, and was unconscious within minutes. The steady, rhythmic sound of tires rolling over asphalt had always helped me fall asleep quickly. There's something almost meditative about that constant, predictable noise that seems to separate you from the rest of the world and wrap you in a cocoon of white noise that drowns out all your worries and concerns. But at approximately 3 in the morning, I was violently ripped from deep sleep by the sound of Ben screaming my name at the top of his lungs. Chris, wake up. You need to look out the window right now." My eyes flew open immediately, my heart instantly pounding as adrenaline flooded my system. I scrambled to sit up, still tangled in the blanket and completely disoriented, thinking we must be crashing or about to collide with another vehicle. Ben was shouting so loudly and with such genuine terror that I was absolutely convinced we were in immediate mortal danger. But when I finally managed to get my bearings, I realized that the truck was still moving smoothly down the highway at a steady 60 miles per hour. There was no screeching of brakes, no swerving, no indication of any kind of vehicular emergency. I climbed forward into the cab area, still groggy and confused, and saw Ben looking like a man who had just stared directly into the face of death itself. His eyes were bulging from their sockets. His face was completely drenched in sweat despite the cool night air, and his jaw was trembling uncontrollably. He maintained one white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel while using his other hand to jab frantically at the passenger window beside me. "It was right there," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain and terror. "Chris, I swear to God, it was right there, keeping perfect pace with us." "What the hell are you talking about?" I croaked, my voice still thick with sleep and confusion. He gritted his teeth, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. Something was running alongside the truck on 2 legs, maintaining our speed of 60 miles per hour. It had these impossibly long arms that seemed to bend the wrong way at the elbows. It didn't have a recognizable face, just smooth, featureless skin like a wax figure, but somehow it was alive and aware. I stared at him for several long seconds, waiting for him to crack a smile or reveal that this was some elaborate practical joke. The punchline never came. When I turned to look out the passenger window, there was nothing visible except shadows, flickering and dancing through the trees in the endless darkness that surrounded us on all sides. "Ben," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm and rational, "you need to settle down, man. You probably dozed off for a second there." I'd witnessed it before, and was prepared to chalk this entire incident up to fatigue and an overactive imagination. "No," he snapped back immediately, his voice filled with absolute conviction. "I wasn't sleeping. I saw it clearly. But somehow I knew it was studying me, examining me, like I was some kind of specimen." That's when we heard it, a loud, heavy impact directly above us, on the roof of the cab. This was something substantial and deliberate, something with significant weight that had landed on our truck intentionally. I immediately climbed into the front passenger seat, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Above us, I could clearly hear something moving round, something unmistakably alive, and each footstep made the metal roof creak and groan in ways that seemed physically impossible. Muttering under his breath, like a prayer or incantation, "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop." Then we heard the most terrifying sound of all, a slow, deliberate scraping noise, as if enormous claws were being dragged across the metal surface of our roof, moving methodically from the front of the cab toward the back in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal behavior. Ben slammed his foot down on the accelerator, and our truck roared forward with a burst of speed. We shot ahead dramatically, but the weight above us shifted and adjusted rather than falling off, indicating that whatever was up there possessed the ability to maintain its grip even under these conditions. It was clinging to us with apparent ease, riding along as if our truck had become its personal transportation. I leaned over toward the driver's side mirror, and that's when I finally saw the creature that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Crouched low at the back edge of our trailer, like some massive, predatory insect, was the thing Ben had described. It had impossibly long, disjointed limbs folded underneath its body in a configuration that looked anatomically wrong. Its skin appeared to be stretched tight over protruding bones, like dried leather that had been pulled beyond its natural limits. Where its face should have been, there were only smooth folds of featureless flesh, yet somehow I was absolutely certain it was looking directly at me with an intelligence that was both alien and malevolent. No indication of departure, just suddenly gone, as if it had never existed at all. We didn't stop driving. We continued for another 90 minutes in complete terrified silence before finally pulling into a truck stop outside Miles City. The facility was empty and eerily quiet, soaked in that pre-dawn stillness that feels almost too peaceful after experiencing genuine terror. He just sat motionless, staring at the dashboard as if it might somehow provide an explanation for what we'd experienced. When I climbed out to inspect our vehicle, I discovered one corner of the trailer roof severely dented inward in an unnatural pattern, surrounded by deep scratches that looked exactly like claw marks. In the center of the damaged area was a greasy black smear, as if something had partially melted onto the metal surface. Ben quit the trucking industry that very day. He didn't even bother to collect his final paycheck. He simply grabbed his duffel bag, muttered something about demons and hell, and took the next Greyhound bus out of town. He never returned my phone calls after that incident, and as far as I know, he never drove another truck again. Whatever he saw that night broke something fundamental inside him that could never be repaired. As for me, I remained in the business, but was forever changed by that encounter. I started sleeping with a knife hidden under my pillow, began taking alternate routes whenever possible, and developed an absolute rule about never driving that particular stretch of Montana highway after midnight, because that thing we encountered wasn't chasing us in any conventional sense. It was playing with us, toying with us, like a cat plays with a mouse before delivering the killing blow. If you ever find yourself driving alone on a lonely highway and think you see something keeping pace with your vehicle in the darkness, don't look directly at it. Don't acknowledge its presence. Just keep your eyes focused straight ahead and your hands firmly on the wheel, because if it decides to lock onto you, it might never let go. Story 30. The Trafficking Discovery. Have you ever hauled cargo that made your skin crawl with unease? Not because of what you knew was contained inside, but because of what you didn't know. Have you ever heard mysterious sounds emanating from your trailer? Faint knocking, shuffling movements, something that almost sounded like breathing in the darkness, something that absolutely shouldn't have been there. I experienced exactly that, and I'll never forget what I discovered, because some jobs don't just change your life trajectory, they fundamentally alter the way you perceive humanity itself and force you to confront the darkest aspects of what people are capable of doing to one another. My name is Jared, and I was 34 years old when this life-altering incident occurred. I'd been working as an independent truck operator for just over 6 years at that point, running my own rig, making my own delivery schedules, and answering to absolutely no one except myself. I genuinely loved the freedom that lifestyle provided. No dispatchers constantly barking orders over the radio. No warehouse managers screaming about load times and delivery deadlines. Just me, the open road, and the steady, comforting hum of my engine carrying me across the country. I was based out of Arizona, but regularly accepted contracts throughout the entire Southwest region. My philosophy was simple. If the compensation was adequate, I didn't ask unnecessary questions about the cargo or its ultimate destination. That approach to business turned out to be my most serious mistake. This particular assignment began in Las Vegas during the middle of summer, when the dry desert heat feels like it's literally peeling the skin from your bones layer by layer. I pulled my rig into a fenced lot on the outskirts of the city, in an area that felt more like an abandoned industrial zone than a legitimate business district. There was nothing remotely official about the location, just a dirt parking area with a rusted trailer that looked like it hadn't been used in years, a portable toilet that had seen much better days, and a couple of rough-looking men sitting in folding chairs, as if they were guarding something extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. They handed me a manila envelope containing exactly $2,000 in cash, all small bills, nothing sequential, the kind of payment that sends up immediate red flags for anyone with experience in legitimate freight transport. They pointed toward a sealed white trailer and gave me instructions that were both simple and ominous. It's ready for transport. Just get it to Reno by morning. No stops, no opening the trailer, and don't ask what's inside. It wasn't the first time I'd heard those exact words, but it would definitely be the last time I chose to ignore the warning signs. The trailer was completely sealed with metal clasps, red wax stamps, and chain links wrapped around the handles. Whoever had loaded this cargo wanted to ensure that absolutely no one would be able to peek inside during transport. The whole situation didn't sit right with me, but I'd encountered stranger arrangements during my years on the road, and the money was too good to pass up. I connected the trailer to my rig and hit Highway 95 heading north toward Reno. It's an incredibly long and lonely stretch of desert highway populated by nothing but endless sand, scattered Joshua trees, and an oppressive silence that seems to stretch on forever. I settled into my driving routine, turned on some late-night talk radio to keep me company, cracked open an energy drink, and let the rhythmic hum of my tires carry me through the vast nothingness of the Nevada desert. About an hour into the journey, I heard something that made me pause and turn down the radio volume. It was a soft thump, just once, then complete silence again. I initially figured that maybe some of the cargo had shifted during transport, loose pallets or unsecured boxes moving around when I took a curve. It happens all the time in freight transport, so I didn't think much of it at first. Then I heard it again, this time noticeably louder and more persistent. Thump, thump, thump. The sound had a rhythmic quality to it, like someone weakly pounding on a wall from the inside. I turned the radio off completely and leaned forward in my seat, straining to listen more carefully. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of wind rushing past my cab and the steady drone of my engine. Then I heard something that I will never be able to forget for as long as I live. It wasn't particularly loud or clear, but it was undeniably real, a muffled scream, long and strained, barely audible, like someone crying out desperately with something shoved in their mouth to prevent them from being heard. I immediately slammed on my brakes and pulled off the highway at the next available turnout. My hands were sweating profusely, my pulse was racing, and I felt like I might actually be sick to my stomach. I sat there, staring at the back of that sealed trailer for what felt like an eternity, knowing that I was trained never to open sealed loads during transport. Breaking those seals would make me legally liable, void my contract, and potentially result in my arrest if the cargo turned out to be something illegal. But this wasn't ordinary freight cargo making those sounds. Something or someone was trapped back there, and they were clearly in distress. I grabbed my bolt cutters from the toolbox mounted under my cab, and the metal seals snapped off easily. The red wax crumbled in my hands like dried blood, and when I pulled open the heavy trailer doors, the stench that poured out hit me like a physical blow to the face. It was the unmistakable smell of human sweat, urine, and something sour and rotting that made my stomach turn violently. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the interior of the trailer. The entire space was packed with wooden crates of various sizes, dozens of them stacked like a giant puzzle, filling every available inch from floor to ceiling. There were no shipping labels, no identifying markings, nothing to indicate what these containers might hold or where they were supposed to be delivered. Then I heard it again, that soft, desperate, whimpering sound. One of the crates near the back of the trailer shifted slightly, and I realized with growing horror that the sound was coming from inside one of those boxes. I dropped to my knees and began frantically yanking at the lid of the moving crate. The nails screeched as the wood splintered under my desperate efforts to pry it open. When the top finally came off, I discovered something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Inside that cramped wooden box was a young girl, probably no more than 15 years old, pale as death itself. Her wrists were secured with plastic zip ties, duct tape covered her mouth, and her eyes were wide with terror, as if she thought I might be there to hurt her rather than help her. She was shaking so violently that I initially thought she might be having some kind of medical emergency. I backed away from the crate, my heart hammering against my chest, so hard I thought it might explode. I immediately called 911 and told the emergency dispatcher everything, my exact location, what I had discovered, and that there were likely more victims in additional crates. The operator instructed me to remain at the scene and assured me that multiple units were already en route to my location. I sat down on the pavement beside my truck, trembling uncontrollably, because suddenly I realized something that made the entire situation even more horrifying. There wasn't just one crate containing a human being. There were more than a dozen similar containers in that trailer, and I had no way of knowing how many of them contained victims. By the time law enforcement arrived, sheriff's deputies, paramedics, and several unmarked government vehicles, I had managed to open 2 additional crates. The second contained another girl, this one barely conscious and clearly drugged. The third held a young boy, maybe 12 years old, who was completely unresponsive and appeared to have been sedated for an extended period of time. All of the victims were in similar conditions, restrained, drugged, and terrified beyond description. The paramedics worked methodically to extract each victim from their wooden prisons, treating them for dehydration, malnutrition, and various injuries. In total, they discovered 6 children, ranging in age from approximately 10 to 16 years old. None of them could initially communicate where they had come from or how long they had been held captive. The investigation that followed revealed that the company I had picked up the load from had completely vanished without a trace. The lot where I had collected the trailer was registered to a shell corporation that no longer existed. The phone number they had given me was disconnected, and the email address was no longer active. Everything about the operation had been carefully designed to disappear the moment law enforcement became involved. This wasn't some isolated incident or amateur operation. It was clearly part of a sophisticated human trafficking network that had been operating for an extended period of time. I had unknowingly become an unwilling participant in one of the most evil enterprises imaginable. One of the crates had a hidden compartment underneath the base that contained something even more disturbing. A tiny crawl space with a filthy mattress, a plastic water jug, and iron shackles bolted directly to the wooden floor. This wasn't just transportation. It was a mobile prison designed to break the spirits of these innocent children. That night fundamentally broke something deep inside me that has never fully healed. I continued driving for a few more months after the incident, but I couldn't sleep properly anymore. I couldn't sit in my cab without constantly wondering what might be in the trailer behind me. Every noise, every small bump or shift in the cargo, I heard it as if it were a human scream for help. Eventually, I gave up trucking entirely, sold my rig, and took a warehouse job where I could see exactly what I was handling every single day. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that trailer and the sounds those children were making. The desperate scratching of fingernails against wood. The muffled cries for help that no one was supposed to hear. I know that I saved those 6 young lives, but I still feel like I was an unwilling participant in something unspeakably evil. And I often wonder how many other similar trailers have passed me on the highways over the years. How many more are out there right now, carrying innocent victims to unimaginable fates? Human trafficking is a very real problem that affects thousands of people every year. And if you ever see something suspicious, please don't hesitate to report it to the authorities immediately.